Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I'm NJ, and tonight we're traveling thousands of years into the world's first truly great superpower, the mighty Persian Empire. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There is nowhere you need to be for the next few hours, and nothing here requires anything of you. You can follow every word, or you can let the words become weather, something happening softly in the background while you drift. Both are perfectly fine. Both are the point. Because tonight we are going somewhere very far away and very long ago. Imagine for a moment that you could stand somewhere high above the ancient world and look down, not as a traveler with dusty feet, but as something weightless, something drifting slowly on a warm current of air. Beneath you, in every direction, lies an empire so vast that no one living within it could ever hope to see all of it. It stretches from the blue edge of the Mediterranean, where fishing boats rock in harbors older than memory, eastwards across mountains and salt flats and rivers, all the way to the Indus Valley, where a different world begins and monsoon clouds gather over green fields. To the north, the grasslands roll away towards the cold. To the south, the desert holds its heat like a closed hand. And between these edges lies everything. 20, perhaps 30 different peoples, speaking languages that have nothing in common with one another. Egyptians, who had already been building in stone for 2,000 years before this empire existed. Babylonians whose astronomers were still recording the movements of the planets on tablets of damp clay. Greeks on the western coastline of what we now call Turkey, arguing in their marketplaces. Nomads on horseback in the far north, farmers in the Nile Delta, mountain shepherds, traders from the coast of Arabia, craftsmen in Anatolia working gold so thin it moves in a breath, all of them, in one way or another, under a single crown. Nothing like it had ever been assembled before, nothing on this scale, holding this many kinds of people, across this much ground, for this long. Let yourself picture it slowly. Endless deserts where the sand takes on a soft rose color in the last light of the day. Fertile river valleys where irrigation channels catch the sun and turn into ribbons of white fire. Caravans of camels moving along ancient roads at a pace that has not changed in 1,000 years. Their bells making a small, patient sound that carries for miles across empty ground. Royal cities rising out of the plain, their walls faced with glazed brick in deep blue and gold and green, so that the whole building seems to glow rather than simply stand. Palaces built on terraces of pale stone, approached by staircases so gentle that a horse could climb them without breaking stride. And gardens, so many gardens, walled enclosures of running water and cypress and rose, laid out with such care that the very word we use for paradise comes to us, through a long chain of borrowings, from the Persian word for one of them. Ruling all of this, a line of kings whose names have survived for 2,500 years. Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, men who governed more human beings than anyone before them, and who left behind roads, laws, coins, palaces, and ideas that outlasted every one of them. We are going to walk through their world tonight, slowly, in no particular hurry. Before we do, just a few small things, and then I will not interrupt you again. If you are enjoying these long history documentaries, it really does help if you tap the like button. It takes a second, and it makes a genuine difference to whether videos like this one find the people who need them at 2 in the morning. If you are new here, consider subscribing, because this is what we do every week. Calm history for tired minds. And leave me a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I read them, and I love seeing the map of this little community fill in, one sleepless city at a time. My book, Sleep into Power, is available now, and the link is down in the description if you would like to take some of this with you into the daytime. These documentaries are also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you would rather listen with the screen off and the phone face down. And if you ever want to support the channel directly, there is a Buy Me a Coffee link below as well. Never expected, always appreciated. That is everything. From here on, it is just you, and me, and Persia. So settle in, let the room go quiet around you, and let us begin a very long way back, before there was any such thing as a Persian Empire, in a place where almost everything in this story was invented first by somebody else. We begin in Mesopotamia. The word simply means the land between the rivers, and the rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. They rise in the mountains of eastern Anatolia and run southeast, roughly parallel, across a wide flat plain, before emptying into the Persian Gulf. Between them lies a country of silt, not stone, not forest. Silt, fine river mud, laid down over hundreds of thousands of years, deep and soft and astonishingly fertile. There is almost no rain here worth mentioning. In the south, a farmer might see a handful of wet days in a year. Everything green in this landscape is green because someone dug a channel and brought water to it by hand. And that single fact, that here you could grow more food than you needed, but only if a great many people cooperated, changed the shape of human life. Picture the plain in the early morning, perhaps 5,500 years ago. Mist sits low over the water. Reed beds rustle along the riverbank, taller than a man, and somewhere inside them, a bird you cannot see makes a sound like a hinge. The air smells of wet clay and wood smoke, and faintly, of the sea. The sun comes up quickly here, without much ceremony, and as it does, the mist lifts and you can see the fields, laid out in long strips, and the ditches feeding them, and the low mounds of villages, and in the distance, something taller than anything nature made, a city. The oldest of them was Uruk, and by around 3,000 years before the Common Era, it may have held 40 or 50,000 people, which at the time made it very likely the largest gathering of human beings anywhere on the planet. Walls of mud brick, streets you could get lost in, temples raised on platforms so that the god had somewhere to stand above the flood. Those platforms grew, over the centuries, into the ziggurats, stepped towers of brick, terrace above terrace, climbing towards a small shrine at the summit. They were not places of worship in the way you might imagine a cathedral. Ordinary people did not go inside. They were staircases, essentially, a convenience for the divine, a place for a god to come down into the world and be housed and fed and dressed and attended to by priests. And in the shadow of those towers, something quietly extraordinary happened. People began pressing marks into wet clay to keep track of things. How many sheep? How much barley? Who owed what to the temple? The marks began as pictures and slowly became wedges, pressed with the cut end of a reed, and the wedges became a script that could hold not just numbers but names, then sentences, then laws, then poems, then a story about a king called Gilgamesh, who went looking for a way not to die and did not find one. Writing was invented here, or at least invented here first among the places we know about, and once it existed, it did not go away. For 3,000 years afterwards, across every empire that rose and fell in this landscape, clerks sat and pressed reeds into clay. Tens of thousands of those tablets survive, being fired hard by accident in the burning of the very palaces they were stored in. They outlasted everything around them. We know the price of a slave, the complaints of a copper merchant, the dream of a king, because somebody made a note, and then the building fell down. Imagine, if you like, the sound of that room. A long hall with narrow windows high in the wall, dust hanging in the beams of light, and a soft, continuous granular noise, like light rain on a tent, which is 30 men pressing reeds into damp clay all at once. Now let the picture widen. Mesopotamia sits inside a larger shape, and if you were to trace it on a map, you would draw a great curve. It begins at the head of the Persian Gulf, runs northwest up the river valleys, turns west across the top of the Syrian desert, and comes down the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, through what is now Syria, Lebanon, Israel and Palestine, before reaching towards the Nile. An arc of green around a core of dry, the Fertile Crescent. It is a modern name, coined little more than a century ago, but the thing it describes is real enough. This band of land is where several of the plants and animals that feed the world were first domesticated. Wheat and barley, lentils and chickpeas, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs. It happened gradually, over thousands of years, in scattered places, by people who had no idea they were doing anything remarkable. They were simply keeping the seeds from the best plants and the calmest animals, year after year, until the plants and animals had changed. And because this crescent is a corridor, a passable route between 3 continents, everybody who ever wanted to move between Africa and Asia and Europe came through it, which made it rich and made it fought over, more or less continuously, for the whole of recorded history. Empires grew here the way weather grows over warm water. Akkad, under Sargon, around 2300 years before the Common Era, often called the first empire of any kind. Ur, the Babylon of Hammurabi, with his famous stone pillar of laws. The Hittites in the Anatolian highlands. Egypt, always somewhat apart, protected by desert on both sides, doing things its own way. And then, from the north of Mesopotamia, out of a homeland along the upper Tigris, came Assyria. Let the temperature of the story cool a little here. The Assyrians had been present in the region for a very long time, as merchants and as a modest kingdom, but from around the 9th century before the Common Era, they built something new, an empire organized for conquest, with a thoroughness nobody had managed before. Standing troops, siege engineering, roads for the movement of soldiers, a system of provinces run by appointed governors who reported to the king, deportation on an enormous scale, whole populations lifted out of their homelands and resettled hundreds of miles away, which broke local loyalties and made rebellion far harder to organize. At its height, under kings with names like Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, Assyria controlled Mesopotamia, much of the Levant, and for a time even Egypt. They also left behind some of the most frightening art in the ancient world. Carved stone panels, several meters long, that lined the corridors of their palaces at Nimrud and Nineveh. Sieges, impalements, cities burning, prisoners in lines, a king in a chariot, calm as a statue, while everything around him comes apart. It is worth pausing on this, because it tells us something about how we know what we know. Those panels were commissioned by Assyrian kings, carved by Assyrian craftsmen, and displayed on the walls of Assyrian palaces, where visiting envoys would have to walk past them on the way to an audience. They are not a neutral record of what happened. They are advertising. The terror was the message. If a foreign ambassador left Nineveh convinced that resistance was hopeless, the carvings had done their work more cheaply than an army could. So when you read that the Assyrians were exceptionally cruel, hold that thought loosely. They were certainly capable of appalling violence, and they used it deliberately. But a great deal of our impression of them comes from their own boasting, and from the writings of people who hated them, and the ordinary texture of Assyrian life, the farming and the letters home and the medical recipes, and the loans between neighbors, is much less visible simply because it made a poorer subject for a wall. Nineveh, their last great capital, sat on the east bank of the Tigris opposite the modern city of Mosul. Ashurbanipal built a library there and filled it with tablets gathered from across Mesopotamia, copies of everything he could obtain, omens and hymns and mathematics and medicine and the Epic of Gilgamesh. It is one of the reasons we can read this civilization at all. And then, quite suddenly, Assyria ended. In the closing years of the 7th century before the Common Era, the empire came under pressure from 2 directions at once. From the south, the Babylonians, under a king named Nabopolassar, who had thrown off Assyrian control. And from the east, down out of the Zagros mountains, a people we call the Medes. Nineveh fell in the year 612 before the Common Era. Within a few more years, the Assyrian state had ceased to exist. Not diminished, gone. When Greek soldiers marched past the ruins 2 centuries later, they asked the locals who had built these enormous walls and got no useful answer. The greatest military power the world had yet produced had been forgotten by the people living on top of it. I want you to hold on to that, gently, because it is going to happen again in this story, to somebody else. Now let the ground begin to rise. East of Mesopotamia, the flat silt plain runs out against a wall of mountains, the Zagros Range, running northwest to southeast for something like 1,500 kilometers, ridge behind ridge, folded like cloth, passes that are green in spring and closed with snow in winter, oak forests on the western slopes, valleys where a village can sit for 1,000 years without anyone below ever quite learning its name. Beyond the mountains, the land opens again onto the Iranian plateau, high, dry, ringed by ranges, with 2 great salt deserts in the interior, so hostile that even now, almost nobody lives in them. It is a country of edges. Life gathers along the foot of the mountains, where the snowmelt comes down, and in the oases, and along the northern strip below the Caspian, which is green and humid and unlike anything else in the region. Into this landscape, somewhere in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, came people speaking Iranian languages. They arrived from the north, from the steppe, in a slow drift over generations rather than an invasion, and their languages belonged to the same enormous family as Sanskrit in India and, further off, as Greek and Latin and eventually English. The word for father in Old Persian is Pita. In Sanskrit, Pita. In Latin, Pater. These languages are cousins, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. 2 of these groups matter for us. In the northwest, around the city of Ecbatana in the high country, the Medes, and further south, in a region called Parsa, which we now call Fars, the Persians. The Medes are frustrating to write about honestly, and I want to be straight with you about why. Almost everything colorful we know about them comes from Herodotus, a Greek writer working in the 5th century before the Common Era, roughly a century and a half after the events he describes, using stories he had been told. He gives us a founding king called Darius, elected because he was so scrupulously fair as a judge that people begged him to rule them. He gives us a dynasty, a capital with 7 concentric walls in 7 different colors, an organized state. The trouble is that the archaeology has not confirmed much of it. Excavation at Ecbatana, which lies under the modern city of Hamadan and is therefore very difficult to dig, has not produced the imperial capital the story requires. Assyrian records mention many Median chiefs, rather than one Median king. Some historians now think the Median Empire, as a centralized state, may never have existed in the form Herodotus describes, and that what actually happened was a powerful confederation of tribal leaders, capable of destroying Nineveh in alliance with Babylon, but much looser than a Greek writer 2 centuries later would have imagined. We do not know. Genuinely, we do not. And I would rather tell you that than hand you a tidy story that might not be true. What does seem clear is that in the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, the Medes were the dominant power on the plateau, and the Persians to their south were subordinate to them. The Persians had their own royal line, which later tradition traced back to an ancestor called Achaemenid, from whom historians take the name Achaemenid. Their kings ruled from Anshan, an old Elamite city, and their world was small. Herds, mountains, a few towns, a fierce reputation, a landscape of oak and rock and thin soil. Nobody at the time would have picked them. Which brings us, at last, to a man. He was born, as far as we can tell, somewhere around the year 600 before the Common Era, into that Persian royal family. His father was Cambyses I, king of Anshan. His mother, according to the tradition, was Mandane, daughter of Astyages, the Median king, which, if true, would make him the grandson of the man he eventually overthrew. His name was Kurush. We know him as Cyrus. Let me tell you the story of his birth as the ancients told it, and then let me take it apart a little, because it is a beautiful story, and it is almost certainly not what happened. Astyages, king of the Medes, dreams that his daughter floods all of Asia. His priests interpret it darkly. He marries her off to a Persian, a lesser man from a lesser place, to keep her line unthreatening. Then he dreams again, and this time a vine grows out of her and covers the whole continent. The meaning is unmistakable. Her son will take his throne. So when the child is born, Astyages gives him to a trusted nobleman, Harpagus, with instructions to kill him. Harpagus cannot bring himself to do it, and passes the task to a herdsman. The herdsman takes the baby home, where his wife has just given birth to a stillborn child. They make a swap. Their own dead son is dressed in the royal clothes and left exposed on the mountain. The living prince is raised as a shepherd's boy. Years later, playing with other children, he is chosen as king in their game, and punishes a nobleman's son for disobedience. The father complains. Astyages summons the boy, sees his own face in him, and works out the truth. He punishes Harpagus in a manner so horrifying that I will not describe it to you tonight, and Harpagus waits, patiently, for many years, for his revenge. It is a wonderful piece of storytelling. It is also, almost element for element, a story that already existed. The infant of royal blood, marked for death, saved by common people, raised in obscurity, returning to claim his birthright. Sargon of Akkad, 17 centuries earlier, was said to have been set adrift, on a river, in a basket of reeds, sealed with pitch. Moses, in the book of Exodus. Romulus and Remus, suckled by a wolf. Oedipus, exposed on a hillside. Later Krishna, later still, in a different form, a great many others. This is what stories do around the founders of things. They gather. When a man turns out to have changed the world, people go back and fill in his childhood with omens, because it feels wrong that something so enormous should have started with an ordinary baby in an ordinary room. And the ancient sources do not even agree with each other. Herodotus gives us this version. Xerxes, a Greek doctor who actually lived at the Persian court a century later, and should therefore have known better, gives a completely different account, in which Cyrus is not related to Astyages at all, but the son of a bandit and a goatherd. Xenophon wrote an entire admiring book about Cyrus, which most scholars treat as a philosophical novel about the ideal ruler rather than a biography. So what can we actually say? That he became king of Anshan somewhere around 559, before the Common Era, that his father and grandfather had ruled before him, that he inherited a small kingdom on the southern edge of a larger power. The rest is fog, and the fog is part of the pleasure of it, I think. Let it be fog for a while. Take a slow breath now, and let it out even more slowly. There is a long way still to go, and nothing about the next few hours needs to be hurried. What we can trace, because more than one independent source records it, is what he did next. Around 550 before the Common Era, Cyrus went to war with Astyages and the Medes. The Babylonian chronicles, which are dry administrative documents with no reason to flatter anybody, record something remarkable about how it ended. Astyages marched out against Cyrus, and his own army mutinied. They seized their king and handed him over. That detail is worth sitting with, because it is the first appearance of something that runs through this whole story. Cyrus did not simply beat people. People kept deciding, at the critical moment, that they would rather have him. Ecbatana fell, its treasury was carried south, and the relationship between Media and Persia was reversed, but not in the way you might expect. Cyrus did not destroy the Median aristocracy or scatter them. He absorbed them. Medes went on holding high office, commanding armies, appearing in court art, dressed in their own distinctive clothing, rather than made to look Persian. For centuries afterwards, Greeks writing about this empire would often simply call the whole thing Median, unable to see quite where one people ended and the other began. Then he turned west. In the western half of Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, lay the kingdom of Lydia, and its king was Croesus. He is remembered for one thing above all others, which is money. Lydia had a river, the Pactolus, that carried electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, down from the hills as fine grains in the sand. And it was in Lydia, probably in the generation or two before Croesus, that somebody had the idea of taking small standardized lumps of this metal and stamping them with a mark that guaranteed their weight and purity. Coinage. Possibly the first true coinage anywhere in the world. The phrase "rich as Croesus" was already proverbial among Greeks within a century of his death, and it is still in use in English 25 centuries later, which is not a bad run for a king whose kingdom lasted about 70 years. Croesus, watching Persia swallow Media, decided to act before Cyrus grew stronger, and here Herodotus gives us one of the most famous scenes in ancient literature. Croesus, before committing himself, sends to the oracle at Delphi to ask whether he should make war on Persia. The oracle replies that if he does, he will destroy a great empire. He goes to war. He destroys a great empire. It is his own. Whether that exchange ever happened, we cannot say. Delphi had every reason to circulate a story that made the oracle look infallible, and the answer, as reported, is suspiciously perfect. But something in it rings true about the period all the same, about the way powerful men heard what they wanted to hear. The campaign itself was decided by weather and by nerve. The two armies met somewhere near the river Halys and fought without a clear result. Winter was coming, and by the conventions of the time, both sides should have gone home to wait for spring. Croesus dismissed his allies and withdrew to his capital at Sardis. Cyrus did not go home, he followed. He arrived outside Sardis with the Lydian army largely dispersed, fought a battle on the plain below the citadel, and then took the fortress in a matter of days by finding a way up a stretch of cliff so steep that nobody had bothered to guard it. The date was probably 547 or 546 before the Common Era, though even that is argued over, because the crucial Babylonian tablet is damaged exactly where the name of the country should be. What happened to Croesus afterwards is genuinely unclear, and the disagreement is instructive. Herodotus has him placed on a pyre to be burned, calling out the name of the Athenian sage Solon, and spared at the last moment by a change of heart and a sudden rainstorm, after which he becomes an honored advisor at the Persian court. A Greek poet, Bacchylides, writing earlier, has Apollo snatch him away to a mythical land in the far north. Some scholars have read the damaged Babylonian chronicle as saying he was simply killed. 3 sources, 3 endings. Take your pick, or take none of them. With Lydia gone, the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast came under Persian control, one after another, some by agreement and some by siege. Miletus, Ephesus, Halicarnassus, Phocaea. Wealthy, quarrelsome, intensely proud maritime towns that had never taken orders from anyone very far away. They would remain a problem for the empire for the next 200 years. And their discontent is where the wars we will come to much later in this story ultimately begin. But for now, let your attention move back east and south, down the rivers, to the oldest and most magnificent city in the world, Babylon. By the 6th century before the Common Era, it had been a great city for well over 1,000 years, and under Nebuchadnezzar II, it had been rebuilt into something meant to overwhelm. Walls so wide that Herodotus claimed a 4-horse chariot could turn on top of them, which is surely an exaggeration, though the walls were genuinely enormous. A processional way running north through the city, paved with limestone, lined with lions in molded colored brick, and at the end of it, the Ishtar Gate, Deep lapis blue, covered in rows of bulls and dragons in gold and white relief, glazed so that in strong sun, the whole surface throws light back at you. A reconstruction of it stands in a museum in Berlin today, built from the original bricks, and people walk into that room and stop talking. 2,500 years later, it still does exactly what it was designed to do. Somewhere in this city, or possibly not, were the Hanging Gardens. I say possibly not, because there is a genuine puzzle here. No Babylonian text has ever been found that mentions them. Nebuchadnezzar, who left inscriptions boasting about a great many things he built, never mentions a wonder of the world in his own back garden. One serious modern argument, put forward by the Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, is that the gardens were real, but were at Nineveh, built by Sennacherib, and that later Greek writers attached the story to the more famous city. It remains debated, but it is a good example of how a thing everybody knows can rest on very little. The king of Babylon in Cyrus's time was Nabonidus, and he was unpopular in ways that turned out to matter. He had spent roughly a decade away from the city, at the oasis of Tamar in northern Arabia, for reasons that are still argued about. In his absence, the New Year festival, the single most important religious event in the Babylonian calendar, could not be properly performed, because the king had to be physically present to take the hand of the god. He also showed a marked devotion to Sin, the moon god, in a city whose great god was Marduk, and appears to have irritated the powerful Marduk priesthood considerably. In the autumn of 539, before the Common Era, Cyrus moved. A battle was fought at Opis on the Tigris. Within days, the city of Sippar surrendered without a fight. And then Babylon itself, the greatest fortified city on earth, opened. Herodotus tells a story of Persian engineers diverting the Euphrates upstream, so that troops could wade in along the riverbed beneath the walls. It is a marvelous image, and most historians doubt it. The Babylonian Chronicle and the Persian account both describe something far less cinematic and far more plausible, which is that the city was handed over. Cyrus entered some days later, and according to the record he had made of it, green branches were spread in front of him in the streets. Now the Cyrus cylinder. It is a barrel-shaped piece of clay, about the length of your forearm, covered in cuneiform, found during excavations in Babylon in 1879, and now in the British Museum. It has been called the first Charter of Human Rights. It has been reproduced at the United Nations. In 1971, it was made the centerpiece of an enormous celebration of Iranian monarchy, staged by the Shah. And that description of it, honestly, is not what the object says. What the cylinder actually contains is a foundation deposit, a text of a kind that Mesopotamian kings had been burying in walls for centuries. It is written in Babylonian, in the Babylonian religious idiom, and it argues that Marduk grew angry with Nabonidus for neglecting his worship, searched the world for a righteous ruler, and chose Cyrus. It describes Cyrus restoring sanctuaries, returning divine statues that Nabonidus had gathered into the capital to their home cities, and allowing displaced people to return to their own places. That is a real policy, and a genuinely intelligent one, but it is not a declaration of universal rights, and it does not mention the Jews. And it was written by Babylonian scribes to justify a conquest to Babylonians. Here is the thing though, even read plainly, without the modern gloss, the policy is remarkable for its time. The Assyrian answer to a conquered people had been to break them, deport them, mix them, erase them. Cyrus, and the empire he founded, seem to have concluded that this was expensive and unnecessary. Leave people their gods. Leave them their languages and their laws and their local structures. Take the taxes and the soldiers and the loyalty, and otherwise let them be. And it worked. It held together an empire of extraordinary diversity for 2 centuries, which is longer than a great many more centralized systems have managed. The best-known consequence is recorded not in Persian sources, but in the Hebrew Bible. The books of Ezra and Chronicles say that Cyrus permitted the Judeans, deported to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier, to return home and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. In the book of Isaiah, he is given a title granted to no other foreign ruler anywhere in the Hebrew Scriptures. He is called the Anointed One, Messiah, a Persian king, worshipping different gods entirely, named as the instrument of another people's deliverance, in their own holy book, where the name still sits today. However you feel about the man, that is a strange and extraordinary afterlife. Cyrus died around 530 before the Common Era, campaigning in the far northeast, out where the empire dissolved into steppe and the settled world gave way to horsemen. Herodotus says he was killed fighting a people called the Massagetai, whose ruler was a woman named Tamiris, and that she had his head brought to her so that she could finally give him his fill of blood. Synthesius tells it differently. Xenophon has him die peacefully at home, in bed, surrounded by his sons, giving a long and dignified farewell speech. You will notice a pattern. The ancients could not agree on how he was born, and they could not agree on how he died. But we know where they put him, because it is still standing. At Pasargadae, on a high windy plain in southern Iran, there is a tomb. It is not large. 6 shallow stone steps rising to a small gabled chamber, the whole thing perhaps 11 meters tall, built of pale limestone blocks, standing alone in open country, with the mountains grey in the distance and the grass moving. It is one of the plainest royal monuments in the ancient world, and it has stood for something close to 2.5 millennia, through the fall of the empire it belonged to, through Alexander, through every subsequent conqueror, into the present. Alexander himself is said to have visited it, found it damaged and looted, and ordered it restored. Picture it in the low gold light of the late afternoon, the stone warm to the touch, wind coming down off the hills, almost nothing else on the horizon. A very quiet ending for a man who rearranged the world. Let that image stay with you for a moment, and then, as the light goes, let us follow what he left behind, because his successors were about to make it very much larger. The son who followed him was Cambyses II, and the great work of his reign was Egypt. Egypt in the 6th century before the Common Era was not a young civilization being introduced to the wider world. It was old, older from the Persian point of view than Persia would ever be. The pyramids at Giza were already more than 2,000 years old when Cambyses arrived, which means the gap between the builders of the Great Pyramid and the Persian conquest is considerably larger than the gap between the Persian conquest and you, listening to this now. He invaded in 525 before the Common Era. The decisive battle was fought at Pelusium, in the eastern delta, and the Egyptian king, Psamtik III, had been on the throne for only a few months. Memphis fell. Egypt became a Persian province, and would remain one, with interruptions, for a very long time. Herodotus, who visited Egypt himself, gives Cambyses an appalling reputation. He has him stabbing a sacred Apis bull, mocking Egyptian religion, desecrating tombs, going mad. Egyptian evidence complicates this considerably. There is an inscription from an Egyptian priest and naval officer named Uja-Horusnet, who served under the Persians, and describes Cambyses as behaving properly towards the temples. And an Apis bull that died during Cambyses' reign was buried with full royal honors, in a sarcophagus he paid for, which is difficult to reconcile with a king who ran one through with a dagger. The likeliest explanation is that Cambyses did reduce temple revenues, which is the sort of thing priests remember for centuries, and that a hostile tradition grew from there and reached Herodotus a lifetime later, already fully formed. There is one more Egyptian story, and it is the one people always want to know about. Herodotus says Cambyses sent an army of 50,000 men west across the desert towards the oasis of Siwa, and that they marched into a sandstorm and were never seen again. Expeditions have looked for them. Claims surface every few decades. nothing has ever been confirmed. It may have happened, in some smaller form. It may be a story told to explain an army that simply turned back. Cambyses died in 522 before the Common Era, on the road home, apparently from an accidental wound to the thigh that turned septic. And what happened next is the murkiest episode in the whole history of the empire. The official version comes from Darius, and he carved it into a cliff. At Behistun, in western Iran, on a limestone rock face high above the old road between Babylon and Ecbatana, there is an enormous relief and a very long inscription in 3 languages. The story it tells is this: Cambyses secretly murdered his own brother, Bardia, before leaving for Egypt. Nobody knew. While Cambyses was away, an impostor, a Magian priest named Gaumata, claimed to be Bardia and seized the throne. Darius, a member of a collateral branch of the royal house, killed the impostor with the help of 6 noble companions and restored the rightful line. There followed a year of rebellion across the empire, 19 battles, 9 captured kings, all of it crushed. The inscription is a magnificent historical document. It is also, transparently, the account of a man explaining why he is entitled to a throne he took by force. The convenient secret murder, unknown to anyone. The impostor so perfect that the dead man's own family did not notice. Modern historians are divided, and many suspect that the man Darius killed was the real Bardia, and that Darius was a usurper who then wrote himself a legitimate story into a cliff where nobody could rub it out. That inscription, incidentally, did something its author never intended. Because it repeats the same text in Old Persian, Elamite and Babylonian, it became the key that allowed 19th century scholars to decipher cuneiform, which unlocked the written record of the entire ancient Near East. Darius's self-justification is the reason we can read Gilgamesh. However he came by it, Darius held the empire, and then he expanded it. Under him, the frontier moved east to the Indus, taking in a region the Persians called Hindush, which is the same word, traveling through Persian and Greek and Latin, that eventually becomes India. It moved northeast across the Oxus into Central Asia, into Bactria and Sogdiana, oasis country of walled towns and irrigated fields between deserts. It moved west into Thrace and touched the edge of Europe. There was a campaign north across the Danube against the Scythians, which achieved very little, because you cannot conquer people who simply ride away. And so, by around 500 before the Common Era, the shape we began with was complete. Try to hold the size of it, gently, in your mind. From the Libyan desert in the west to the Indus in the east is more than 4,500 kilometers in a straight line. From the Aral Sea in the north to the Persian Gulf and the first cataract of the Nile in the south is perhaps 3,000. Something in the region of 5 million square kilometers under one administration, at a time when the fastest possible communication was a horse. The population is genuinely uncertain, and you will see wildly different figures quoted. Serious estimates tend to sit somewhere between about 17 million and perhaps 35 million people, and some older accounts push far higher. What is not really in doubt is that this was, by a considerable margin, the largest number of human beings ever gathered under a single government up to that point in history, a very substantial share of everyone alive, and they were not one people made to look alike. In the reliefs at Persepolis, which we will walk through together before the night is over, the subject nations come forward in procession, and every one of them is carved wearing their own clothes. Their own hats, their own beards, their own shoes, bringing their own local goods. Nobody has been made Persian. The variety is the boast. Now, holding an empire that size together requires something more than an army, because an army can only be in one place. It requires a way of moving information faster than trouble can spread, and the Persians built one. Let the picture change again. The palaces recede, and instead you are standing at the edge of a road. It is not much to look at first. A track of beaten earth and gravel, wide enough for 2 carts to pass, running away from you in both directions, until the land takes it. In places there is stone laid down, and in the mountains there are cuttings where somebody has taken tools to a shoulder of rock to ease a gradient. And at the rivers there are bridges of timber on stone piers, or flat ferries hauled on ropes. But mostly it is simply a road, the way roads have always mostly been. What matters is not the surface, it is the length, and what runs along it. The most famous of these routes ran from Sardis, near the Aegean coast in western Anatolia, all the way east and south to Susa, in the lowlands of what is now southwestern Iran. Herodotus, who was interested in this sort of thing, counted the posting stations along it. He gives 111 of them, and a total distance that works out at somewhere near 2,500 kilometers, and he says that a man walking it steadily, resting at a station each night, would arrive after about 90 days, 3 months, from the edge of the Greek world to the heart of the empire. Now hold that number, because here is the part that made the empire work. A royal message did not travel at 90 days, it traveled at something closer to a week. The system was simple and, once you see it, obvious, though nobody had built it at this scale before. At every station along the road, a fresh horse stood ready, and beside it a fresh rider. A courier came in at speed, handed over the dispatch, and stopped. The waiting rider was already moving before the dust had settled. He rode his stage, handed on, and stopped, and so on, through the night, through weather, through the dark, day after day, the message traveling at the speed of a galloping horse continuously, rather than at the speed of a man and an animal who both need to sleep. Herodotus was genuinely impressed by this, and he wrote a line about these couriers that has had an extraordinary afterlife. He said that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor the dark of night prevented them from completing their assigned stage as fast as they possibly could. If that has a familiar ring to it, there is a reason. A version of that sentence is carved along the front of the old General Post Office building in New York, where it has been widely mistaken for an official motto of the American Postal Service, which it never formally was. A Greek tourist's admiring note about Persian horsemen cut into granite in Manhattan, 24 centuries later. The Greeks called this relay system the Angarion. The Persians themselves, in the administrative records, use a word that translates roughly as fast runners. And those administrative records are where this stops being a traveler's tale and becomes something you can hold in your hand. Because at Persepolis, archaeologists found tablets, tens of thousands of them, most of them small, most of them mundane, recording the movement of food and supplies through the empire's heartland. And among them is a whole category of document concerning travel. Here is how it worked. If you needed to move along the royal road on official business, you carried a sealed authorization. The word for it was halmi. It named you, stated your destination, and specified what you were entitled to draw at each station. How much flour, how much wine or beer, how much meat, and for how many people and animals. You presented it. The station master issued the rations and recorded the transaction on clay. That tablet went into an archive, and 25 centuries afterwards, somebody dug it up and read it. So we have, sitting in museum drawers, the travel documents of the ancient world. We can follow named individuals across the empire. We can see a party of workers being moved from Egypt to Persepolis. We can see a woman of the royal household traveling with her retinue and drawing supplies at each stop. We can see the sealed order of a satrap, honored 1,000 kilometers from where it was written, because the seal was recognized and the system held. That is what an empire actually is, when you strip away the crowns. Not conquest, administration. A clerk in a mud brick building in the middle of nowhere, issuing 40 liters of barley to a stranger because a lump of clay says he should. Picture that road at dusk, the light going amber, then grey, a caravan coming in for the night, 40 camels and mules, roped nose to tail, their loads swaying. Bales of wool, jars sealed with pitch, somebody's household goods. The animals smell water and quicken slightly, which is the only thing all day that has made them hurry. The station is a low-walled compound, with a well and a courtyard, and stabling along one side. Fires are already lit. There is a smell of dung smoke and hot flatbread, and the sharp green smell of crushed herbs. Men are unloading, calling to each other in 2 or 3 languages, and none of it is urgent. A dog moves between the fires without much hope. And then, from the west, faint at first, the sound of a horse being ridden hard. Everyone in the courtyard hears it, and nobody stops what they are doing. A rider comes in through the gate at a canter, already swinging down. There is a brief exchange, a pouch handed over, and the next man is out through the gate and gone, and the sound of him fades east into the dark, and the courtyard goes back to its bread and its unloading. That happened, night after night, for 200 years, on roads running to Egypt and to Bactria, and down towards the Indus. It is one of the quietest and most consequential things anybody in the ancient world ever built. Let your breathing slow a little now. The caravan is settled. The fires are burning down, and we are going to follow this road east, over the mountains, into the Persian homeland, to see what all of it was ultimately pointing towards. You arrive at Persepolis before dawn, which is the right way to arrive. The Persians called it Parsa, which simply means Persia. The name we use is Greek, and it means city of the Persians, though there is a rather grim pun buried in it, because a similar-sounding Greek phrase means destroyer of cities, and Greek writers were not above enjoying that. It sits at the foot of a mountain called Ku-e-Rahmat, the Mountain of Mercy, on a fertile plain in southern Iran. Darius began it around 518 before the Common Era, and it was still being added to more than a century later, under kings who had never known him. 3 generations of masons lived and died on this site. The first thing you notice in the half-light is that the whole complex stands on an artificial platform, not a hill, a terrace built out from the mountainside roughly 450 meters by 300. Faced with enormous blocks of grey limestone fitted together without mortar and held, where they needed holding, with iron cramps poured in lead. To get up onto it, you take the staircase, and the staircase is where the design starts talking to you. It is a double flight, curving back on itself, and it has 111 steps, and those steps are wide and extremely shallow, so shallow that they are almost uncomfortable if you try to climb them quickly. You cannot stride, you cannot bound. The proportions force you into a slow, even processional pace, and you arrive at the top unhurried and unwinded, with your robes hanging properly and your breath unchanged. They were designed so that a delegation could ascend with dignity, and possibly so that a horse could be ridden up. Either way, the building has taken control of how you move before you have gone through a single door. At the top stands the Gate of All Nations, built by Xerxes, and at its entrance are colossal figures carved from single blocks of stone, bulls facing outward, and on the inner side, human-headed winged bulls, a form the Persians borrowed directly from Assyrian palace art, which tells you something about how empires inherit from the ones they replace. Xerxes left an inscription here, in 3 languages, saying that he built this gate, and that much other good construction was done in Parsa, and that he built it by the favor of Ahura Mazda. There is very little boasting about conquest in it. Persian royal inscriptions are strikingly light on battles. What they talk about, again and again, is building things, and holding things together, and truth. Walk through the gate as the sky begins to go pale. Ahead of you is the Apadana, the great audience hall, and it is difficult to convey the scale of it because so little is standing. Imagine a hall roughly 60 meters square with a forest of columns inside it, 72 of them, each around 20 meters tall, which is the height of a 6-story building. Slender, fluted, standing on bell-shaped bases, topped with double bull capitals carved so that the 2 halves of the animal face away from each other, and the roof beams rest in the hollow between. 13 of those columns still stand. 13 out of 72, and they are enough to stop you in your tracks. The roof was cedar, brought from Lebanon. The doors were faced with metal. And here is the thing that photographs cannot tell you, and that even standing there will not tell you, because the evidence is only traces now. It was painted. We see Persepolis as grey and gold stone, austere and monochrome, and that is entirely an accident of time. Chemical analysis of surviving fragments has found pigment, Egyptian blue, reds and greens, gold leaf on details. The reliefs had inlaid eyes. Some of the figures wore actual metal jewelry, fitted into drilled sockets. The building we admire for its restraint was, when new, a riot of color under a hard blue sky, glittering wherever the sun caught gold. Now go to the north staircase of the Apadana and slow right down, because this is the single most remarkable thing on the site. Along the retaining wall of the stairs runs a procession, carved in low relief, still astonishingly crisp, because much of it lay buried under rubble for 2,000 years. On one side, rows of guards and courtiers, Persians and Medes alternating, some of them holding hands, or resting a hand on the shoulder of the man in front, in a gesture that reads as unexpectedly gentle. And on the other side, the delegations, 23 of them by the usual count, each a small group of figures, led by a Persian usher, who holds the leader by the hand, drawing him forward, and every single delegation is carved as itself. The Elamites bring a lioness and her cubs. The Armenians bring a horse and a vessel with handles shaped like winged animals. The Lydians bring bowls and bracelets and a 2-horse chariot. The Bactrians bring a camel. The Indians come barefoot in light clothing, with baskets carried on a shoulder pole and an ass. The Ethiopians bring an okapi and an elephant tusk. The Arabians bring a dromedary. The Scythians come in pointed caps with folded trousers, bringing horses and clothing, and they are the only delegation permitted to keep their weapons, which historians have argued about ever since. Nobody has been made uniform. Nobody has been stripped or bound or shown in defeat. Every group wears its own dress, its own beard, its own hat, its own shoes, and brings the thing its own country actually produces. Compare that to the Assyrian panels we stood in front of earlier, with their siege ramps and their lines of the impaled. Same region, same medium, barely 2 centuries apart. Completely opposite argument about what an empire is for. That does not make the Persians gentle. These delegations are bringing tribute, and tribute is extracted, and behind the carving stands an army. But the story the empire chose to tell about itself, on its most important wall, was that its greatness lay in the number of different peoples who came willingly up those stairs, still recognizably themselves. Beyond the Apadana lies the throne hall, sometimes called the Hall of 100 Columns, begun by Xerxes and finished by his son. Then the private palaces, smaller and more intimate, with windows of solid stone frames and door jambs carved with the king going about his household, attended by servants carrying a parasol and a fly whisk and a towel. And then the treasury, which is where the story changes shape entirely. The treasury was a large, plain, heavily walled complex on the southeast of the terrace. It held valuables, certainly. But what makes it precious to us is that it held paperwork, and that the paperwork was clay, and that when the building burned, the clay baked hard. Together with a second archive found in the fortification wall on the north, these tablets number in the tens of thousands. They are, overwhelmingly, boring. Receipts, ration lists, transfers of grain and wine and livestock, payments to work gangs, and they quietly demolish one of the oldest assumptions about how a thing like Persepolis gets built. The workers were paid, not all of them free in a modern sense, and the labor system was complex and included dependent workers with limited freedom of movement. But the archive records wages, issued in silver and in kind, to named groups: stonecutters, goldsmiths, carpenters, sculptors, treasury craftsmen. They record men and women working alongside each other. They record women supervisors receiving higher rations than the men they oversaw. And they record something so unexpectedly humane that it is worth saying slowly. New mothers received an extra ration, a supplementary issue of wine or beer and grain, given for a set period after childbirth. And in some of the tablets, the allowance for a woman who had borne a son is larger than for one who had borne a daughter, which tells you the world was not fair, but the allowance existed. It was administered and recorded and issued in the middle of a building site, 25 centuries ago. Whoever you were expecting to find dragging these stones, it was not this. Persepolis was not the only capital, and probably not the working one. The empire ran from Susa, in the hot lowlands, where Darius built an enormous palace and left an inscription that is one of my favorite documents in all of ancient history, and we will come back to it shortly. The court moved with the seasons. Susa in winter, Ecbatana up in the mountains for the cool of summer, Babylon, Pasargadae. What Persepolis was for is genuinely debated. The old and much repeated idea is that it was a ceremonial capital where the empire assembled for the Spring New Year festival, and the tribute procession on the staircase has often been read as exactly that. It is an attractive theory. It is also not proven, and a number of serious scholars have pushed back on it. The tablets show the site occupied and working all year round, feeding thousands of people, which looks less like a stage set and more like a functioning center. Perhaps both, perhaps a working administrative heart that also, when the king was in residence, became the place where the whole world came up the stairs. Stand on the terrace now, with the sun properly up. The stone has begun to warm. Below you the plain runs away green and brown to distant hills. Behind you the mountain holds the royal tombs, cut into the cliff face, their entrances carved as the fronts of palaces, so that a dead king appears to be standing at his own door. Wind moves through the standing columns and makes no sound at all, because there is nothing left for it to catch. Let that stay a moment, and then let us come down off the terrace, because almost nobody in this empire ever went up it. For every person who walked those stairs, there were many thousands living lives that left no carving anywhere. And it is those lives, in the villages and the market towns and the irrigated fields, that we can turn to now. Start with water, because on the Iranian plateau everything starts with water. There is not enough of it, and what there is falls as snow on mountains far from where people want to live. Surface channels crossing hot open ground lose an enormous amount to evaporation. So somebody, perhaps as early as the first millennium before the Common Era, solved this in a way that still seems slightly unreasonable when you first hear it. They put the channel underground. A qanat begins with a mother well, sunk at the foot of the mountains until it reaches the water table. From that well, a tunnel is dug, running very slightly downhill, sometimes for tens of kilometers, all the way to the settlement. Along its length, vertical shafts are cut down from the surface at intervals to remove spoil, to bring air to the diggers, and to allow future maintenance. Water enters at the mountain end and emerges, at the far end, into daylight. It never sees the sun in between. It does not evaporate. It arrives cool, and it arrives by gravity, requiring no pump, no animal, no fuel, forever. The work was appalling. Men working by lamplight in a tunnel, barely wide enough to kneel in, hauling baskets of spoil to a shaft, with the constant risk of collapse. The men who did it were specialists, and the trade passed down families. From the air, an old qanat line is unmistakable. A row of low circular craters, each ringed by the mound of earth pulled out of it, running dead straight across empty desert from the hills to a green patch. Thousands of them crisscross Iran, and some are still delivering water today, after more than 2,000 years, having been cleaned and repaired by hand across 100 generations. Follow one to its end, and you find the village. Mud brick houses, flat-roofed, thick-walled. The walls are thick because mud brick is a superb insulator, and inside, at the height of a summer afternoon, it is startlingly cool. Rooms open onto a courtyard rather than the street, so the family life turns inward, away from the dust and the eyes of passers-by. In the courtyard, a tree for shade, and a channel of water, and probably a vine. The roof is where you sleep in high summer, lying out under a sky with more stars in it than you have ever seen, because there is no light anywhere for 100 miles except fire. The fields around the village grow barley and wheat, and barley more than wheat, because barley tolerates salt and drought better. There are orchards, vines, alfalfa for the animals, goats and fat-tailed sheep going out at first light with a boy behind them, and coming back at dusk in a cloud of their own dust. The year turns on water and on the calendar of planting and harvest, and it turned that way here for millennia before Cyrus, and for millennia after Alexander, and the empire mostly passed over the top of it like weather. As for what children were taught, we have a famous line from Herodotus, who says the Persians educated their sons between the ages of 5 and 20 in 3 things only: to ride a horse, to use a bow, and to speak the truth. It is a Greek account of a foreign people, and Greek accounts of foreign peoples are always partly about the Greeks. But this one has an unusual amount of support, because the Persians themselves, in their own inscriptions, in their own language, are obsessed with exactly this. Darius, on the cliff at Behistun, does not primarily present himself as a conqueror. He presents himself as a man who defeated the Li. He says the rebel kings were liars, that they lied to the people, that the lie made the provinces rebellious. He asks Ahura Mazda to protect the land from enemy armies, from famine, and from the lie, and he lists them as 3 comparable dangers: an enemy army, a failed harvest, and falsehood, set side by side as threats of the same order. Whatever you make of a usurper carving a defense of his honesty into a cliff, the value system underneath it is real, and it runs right through Persian religion, which we will come to properly a little later tonight. Now come out of the village and into a town on market day. The noise is layered rather than loud. Under everything, animals. Then the sound of trade, which is 2 people disagreeing about a price in a manner that is neither angry nor brief. Somewhere, metal on metal, a slow, uneven tapping. Somewhere else, the wooden knock of a loom. The craftsmen are where this empire becomes something you can almost touch, and there is a document about them that I want to give you in full, because it is the loveliest administrative text in the ancient world. When Darius built his palace at Susa, he left an inscription describing how it was made, and it is not a list of his own achievements. It is a list of where everything came from. The timber, a cedar, was brought from a mountain in Lebanon. Other timber came from Gandhara and Carmania. The gold came from Sardis and from Bactria. The lapis lazuli and the carnelian came from Sogdiana. The turquoise from Chorasmia. The silver and the ebony from Egypt. The ornamentation from Ionia. The ivory from Ethiopia and from India and from Arachisia. And then the people. The stone was worked by Ionians and Lydians. The goldsmiths were Medes and Egyptians. The men who worked the wood were Lydians and Egyptians. Those who made the baked brick were Babylonians. Those who decorated the wall were Medes and Egyptians. It reads like the closing credits of a film. A king, at the height of his power, taking the trouble to record that his palace was built by Ionian stonemasons and Egyptian goldsmiths and Babylonian bricklayers, and naming them by their nations. That is the empire's self-image again, and it is consistent. Not one people imposing itself. A collection of peoples, each doing the thing it is best at, assembled into something none of them could have made alone. Think about the workshops behind that. The potters, throwing on wheels, making the storage jars and cooking pots and drinking cups that turn up in every excavation in their tens of thousands. Because pottery breaks but does not rot. and is therefore the archaeologist's most faithful friend. The metalworkers, who in this empire reached a level that is genuinely hard to believe. There is a hoard called the Oxus treasure, found in the 19th century near the river Oxus in Central Asia, and now mostly in the British Museum, and it contains objects that will change your idea of what these people could do. A pair of gold armlets with terminals shaped as winged griffins, the horns and wings once inlaid with colored stone and glass. Miniature gold chariots with 4 horses and 2 riders, complete, the size of your palm, the harness rendered. Gold plaques, thin as paper, showing figures carrying bundles of sacred twigs. Drinking vessels shaped as animals called reiter, where the cup rises from the shoulders of a leaping ibex or a winged lion. The whole thing worked from gold or silver, the animal's musculature caught with real anatomical understanding. And the weavers. Textiles almost never survive, which means that an entire art form, probably the one that most filled the daily visual world of these people, is almost entirely lost to us. Almost. In the 1940s, Soviet archaeologists excavating burial mounds in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, at a place called Pazyryk, opened a tomb where water had seeped in and frozen solid, sealing the contents in permanent ice. Inside, preserved, was a knotted pile carpet. It dates to roughly the 5th century before the Common Era. It is about 2 meters square. It has a central field of squares, and borders showing grazing deer and further out, a procession of horsemen, some riding and some walking beside their mounts. The knot density is extraordinarily fine, far too fine for a first attempt at anything. It is the oldest pile carpet known to exist. Where it was made is debated, but many specialists see strong Achaemenid influence, and the horsemen would not be out of place on the Persepolis stairs. What it proves, above all, is that carpet weaving at a very high level of sophistication already existed at this date, which means the tradition behind it is older still. Everything perished except one, and one survived by pure accident of ice. The same is true of the food, in a different way. It perished entirely, and yet we know a surprising amount about it, because it was rationed and therefore written down. Come and eat. Bread first, always. Flat rounds of barley or wheat dough, slapped onto the hot inner wall of a clay oven, and peeled off blistered and steaming a minute later. It is eaten with everything and used as plate, spoon, and napkin. Even now, in that part of the world, bread is treated with a seriousness that the word does not carry in English. Then dates. On the palm, they hang in heavy amber clusters, and the harvest requires somebody to climb a swaying trunk with a rope. Fresh, they are almost too sweet. Pressed into blocks, they keep for a year and travel anywhere, which made them the ideal food for a road. Pomegranates, which the Persians grew and which appear all over their art. Break one open, and it is startling every time, that dense red interior in its pale chambers. Pistachios, native to this region, salted or plain. Figs, which if you have only eaten dried ones, are a completely different fruit fresh, soft, warm from the tree, splitting under a thumb. Honey, from wild and kept bees, doing the work that sugar would do very much later. And herbs, in a quantity that a European kitchen would find eccentric. Mint, coriander, tarragon, dill, chives, basil, served not chopped as seasoning, but heaped whole in a bowl in the middle of the table, to be eaten by the handful alongside everything else, with white cheese and bread and raw onion. This is still done. Walk into a family home in Iran tonight, and there will be a plate of herbs on the table. Meat was for those who could afford it, and for occasions. Lamb, mostly, from the fat-tailed sheep, and the fat itself was prized as a cooking medium. Roasted whole over embers for a feast, or cut small and cooked slowly with fruit and nuts, which is the ancestral shape of a whole family of Iranian dishes. The sweetness of dried fruit or pomegranate against the fat of the meat, thickened with ground walnuts, sharpened with something sour. The ration tablets record the ordinary reality of the drink, beer and wine, issued by the jar to workers as part of their pay. At the top of society, it became something else. Greek writers describe Persian banquets in tones of appalled fascination, listing courses and vessels and quantities, and it is important to notice that they are moralizing. Luxury, to a certain kind of Greek writer, was the explanation for why Persia would eventually lose, and so the accounts of Persian dining are doing argumentative work as well as reporting. Herodotus does give us one custom about wine that is too good to leave out, and which may even be true. He says that when the Persians had an important decision to make, they would debate it while drunk, and then reconsider the same question sober the next day. Or, if they had first discussed it sober, they would review it again over wine. Only what survived both conditions was acted upon. As a piece of committee procedure, it has, honestly, a certain logic. And water. Herodotus says that whenever the great king traveled, he took with him water from the river Coaspes near Susa, boiled and carried in silver flasks on a train of mule carts, and drank no other water anywhere. It sounds absurd, and it is probably at least partly true, and there is something oddly touching in it. The most powerful man in the world, in a tent in Anatolia or Egypt, drinking the taste of home. What that king was wearing, as he drank, is the next thing worth looking at, because Persian dress caused more comment among their neighbors than almost anything else about them. The scandal, from the Greek point of view, was trousers. Greeks wore draped cloth, a rectangle of wool, pinned and belted, nothing tailored, nothing sewn to the shape of a limb. Trousers were to them a barbarian garment, faintly ridiculous and faintly effeminate, and they never quite got over seeing them. But trousers come from the steppe, and the steppe is where horses come from. If you spend your life on the back of an animal, draped cloth is useless, and sewn leg coverings are obviously correct. The Iranian peoples brought this with them from the north, and the Persians, in adopting Median court dress, adopted the riding costume of a horse people, fitted trousers, a sleeved tunic, a belted coat, and soft-laced ankle boots with a strap. At court there was a second style, the long pleated robe you see on the Persepolis reliefs. It falls in deep vertical folds from shoulder to instep, with wide sleeves gathered into stacked horizontal pleats. And it is not a garment for doing anything in. It announces that the wearer does not need to move quickly. Persians in the reliefs generally wear this, with a tall fluted cap. Medes wear the riding dress, with a rounded cap that can be drawn across the face against dust. Both appear side by side, alternating, all the way up the stairs. Two costumes equally honored in a single procession. Over it, color. Persian textiles used deep purples, reds and blues, and purple in this world was expensive beyond reason, because it came from a sea snail and required thousands of animals for a small quantity of dye. Robes were embroidered with gold, sometimes with actual gold thread worked into the cloth, and the reliefs show borders and roundels that must have been dazzling in the original. Then jewelry, and here the Persians were unrestrained. Twisted torques at the throat, ending in animal heads. Heavy bracelets, worn by men in quantity. Earrings. The oxus armlets again, with their griffins. Gold appliques sewn directly onto clothing in their hundreds, so that a garment shifted and glittered as its wearer walked. And grooming, which mattered enormously. Beards were long, and worked into tight regular curls with hot irons, and so was the hair beneath the cap. There are cosmetic implements in the archaeological record, tweezers and mirrors and containers for coal. Greek writers found this fussy and said so. It seems to have been an absolute mark of status. To appear in public elaborately arranged was to demonstrate that you had people and time. Military equipment was different in character and lighter than a Greek would have liked. The infantry carried a large rectangular shield woven from wicker, sometimes faced with hide, which could be planted in the ground to form a wall. Behind that wall, archers shot volleys, a short spear, a bow and a combined case for bow and arrows worn on the hip. Scale armor of small metal plates sewn onto a backing for those who could afford it, and often nothing much at all beyond a padded coat for those who could not. It was an army designed around missiles and mobility, in a world of open ground and horses. Against another such army, it was devastating for 200 years. Against massed heavy infantry in a narrow space, it would eventually have a problem, and we will get there in due course. But not yet. Because before any of that, there is somewhere I have been wanting to take you all night, and now the day has warmed enough for it to be exactly right. There is a door in a high mud wall, and it is standing open. Go through it. The first thing is the temperature. The air on this side is several degrees cooler, and you feel it on your face immediately, the way you do stepping into a church in summer. The second thing is the sound, which is water, running somewhere close, continuously. And the third thing is the geometry. Ahead of you, a channel of water runs dead straight, lined with cut stone, from where you stand to the far wall. Another crosses it at right angles at the center, and where they meet, there is a square basin. The four quarters made by those channels are planted. Fruit trees, roses, herbs, all of it dense and green and deliberate. Along the main axis stand cypresses, tall and dark and narrow, evenly spaced, so that the eye is carried down the line of them to the far end. Outside this wall, within a few meters of where you are standing, the land is stone and dust and thorn and heat. Inside, that contrast is the entire idea. A Persian garden is not a piece of tamed countryside. There is no countryside here to tame. It is a rectangle of the impossible, cut out of an indifferent landscape and defended by a wall. And everything about it, the symmetry, the enclosure, the sheer visible extravagance of running water through a desert, says the same thing. This place has been made, at cost, on purpose. The old Iranian word for such an enclosure was Paradisa, which is put together from a word meaning around and a word meaning wall, a thing walled about. Xenophon, the Greek soldier and writer, spent time in the Persian world, encountered these gardens, was clearly enchanted by them, and needed a word. So he borrowed theirs and wrote it in Greek as paradisos. That Greek word was then used by the translators who rendered the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, and it is the word they chose for the garden in Eden. From Greek it went into Latin, and from Latin into practically every language in Europe, which means that when anyone anywhere says the word paradise in any of 100 languages, what they are actually reaching for, at the bottom of the etymology, is a walled Persian garden with water running through it. The oldest one we can walk in is at Pasargadae, Cyrus's own capital, a short distance from his tomb. Excavation there has uncovered the stone water channels and the square basins of a formal garden laid out around 540 before the Common Era, with the palaces arranged around it and colonnades looking onto it. The channels are divided into four by crossing watercourses. That fourfold plan is called a Shahar Bagh, four gardens, and it has an enormous future ahead of it. It runs forward through Persian gardens under later dynasties, into the gardens of the Islamic world, into the courtyards of the Alhambra in Spain, into the Mughal gardens of India. The garden at the Taj Mahal is a Chahar Bagh. The formal parterres of Europe owe it a debt at several removes. The plan Cyrus's gardeners laid out on a plain in Fars is, in a real sense, still being planted. Xenophon also gives us a small scene about a garden which I love. He describes the Spartan commander Lysander being shown around a garden at Sardis by the Persian prince Cyrus the Younger. Lysander admires the beauty of it, the spacing of the trees, the straightness of the rows, the sweetness of the scents, and Cyrus tells him that he laid it out himself, and that some of the trees Lysander is looking at, he planted with his own hands. Lysander stares at his host, at the robes, the gold collar, the bracelets, the whole apparatus of Persian royalty, and he says, more or less, you planted these yourself. with those hands?" And Cyrus says yes, and adds that he never sits down to dinner without first having worked up a sweat at something, either gardening or war or exercise. "Stay in that garden with me for a while, because there is nowhere better to rest tonight. Lie back somewhere in the shade of a plane tree, where the ground is cool." The cypresses stand along the water absolutely still, because there is not enough wind in here to move them. Roses, and the Persians grew a great many roses, are heavy with heat, and the scent comes and goes in slow waves rather than staying constant, so that you keep noticing it again. The water in the stone channel is running, very shallow, over ridges deliberately cut into the bed to make it break and catch the light, and more importantly, to make it speak. Someone worked out, a long time ago, exactly what shape of stone produces the most restful sound from the least amount of water. There are birds, unbothered, moving in the fruit trees. Somewhere a fountain, fed only by gravity, by the fall of the land from the mountains through a tunnel dug by hand, is pushing a soft column of water into a marble basin, and it has been doing that all day, and will do it all night whether anyone is here or not. The light comes down through the leaves in shifting coins. Nothing here is urgent. Nothing here needs you. This is what the wealthiest people in the ancient world wanted, when they could have had anything at all. Not a bigger hall, not another wall of carvings about themselves. Shade, running water, the smell of fruit trees, and quiet. They were not wrong. Let your eyes close for a while, if they have not already. The garden will still be here, and when you are ready, we will follow the water back to its source, and go up into the hills, where there is a fire that has been kept burning for longer than anyone can remember, and a question about how the world is put together that the Persians answered in a way nobody had before. The building is smaller than you expected. That is usually the first surprise. There is no great hall here, no forest of columns, nothing designed to make you feel small. Just a modest square chamber of stone or brick, domed, standing on high ground, with a colonnade around it, and the wind coming through. Inside, on a raised stone plinth shaped something like a wide cup on a stem, there is a fire. It is not large, it is not roaring. It has been fed, carefully, at fixed hours, by a priest who covers the lower half of his face with a white cloth so that his breath does not fall on it. It has been burning like this, without ever being allowed to go out, for longer than anyone present can account for. In some places, the tradition holds that a particular flame has been carried forward, hearth to hearth, for well over 1,000 years. The room smells of sandalwood and of hot stone. Let me tell you what the Persians believed, and let me be careful, because this is a living religion with adherents today, and it deserves to be described accurately rather than decoratively. It begins with a man whose name in Old Iranian was Zarathustra, and who reaches us through Greek as Zoroaster. He was, as far as we can reconstruct, a priest of an older Iranian religious tradition who had some kind of profound reordering of his understanding and began teaching something new. When he lived is one of the genuinely unresolved questions of ancient history, and the range of proposed dates is not small. Some Greek writers placed him thousands of years before their own time, which nobody now accepts. The most widely respected modern approach works from language. The 17 hymns called the Gathas, which are believed to be Zarathustra's own compositions, are written in a form of Old Avestan so archaic and so close to the language of the Rigveda in India that many linguists date them to somewhere between 1500 and 1000 years before the Common Era. Others argue for a much later figure, closer to 600, nearer the Persian kings themselves. So he lived somewhere in a window 1,000 years wide, probably in Central Asia or Eastern Iran, among a cattle-keeping people. That is roughly the honest limit of what can be said. What he taught, however, we can approach directly, because the Gathas survive. At the center is one god, Ahura Mazda, which means something like the wise Lord, not one god among many, and not a national god of a particular people, but the creator of the sky and the waters and the earth and the light, and of good thought itself. Against Ahura Mazda stands a hostile spirit, and here the tradition develops over time in ways worth being careful about. In the oldest hymns, the picture is of two primordial spirits, one choosing truth and one choosing falsehood, and the choice is the thing that defines them. In the later developed tradition, this becomes a more thoroughgoing opposition between Ahura Mazda and a figure called Angra Mainyu, later Ahriman, a cosmic conflict running through the whole of creation. And that conflict is not fought between distant powers over your head. It runs through you. The central pairing in the Gathas is between Asha and Druj. Asha is truth, but it is wider than that. Rightness, order, the way things properly are, the correct grain of the universe. Druj is the Li, and it too is wider than a false statement. It is disorder, deceit, the twisting of what is. And every human being is understood to be genuinely free to choose between them, not fated, not born into a side, choosing, repeatedly, in ordinary life, by what you think, and what you say, and what you do. The formula that comes down through the tradition is exactly that: good thoughts, good words, good deeds. Now think back with me to a cliff face in western Iran. Darius, on the rock at Behistun, defending his claim to a throne, does not describe his enemies as weak or foreign or unworthy. He describes them as liars. He says the lie made the provinces rebellious. He prays that Ahura Mazda will protect the land from the enemy army, from famine, and from the Li. That is not a coincidence of vocabulary. Whatever the precise relationship between the Persian kings and the teaching of Zarathustra, and we will come to that in a moment, they were operating inside the same moral universe. Falsehood was not a social failing. It was a force, and it was the enemy. And a king's job was to hold it back the way you would hold back an invasion or a drought. Which brings us back to the fire. It is important to be clear, because the misunderstanding is very old, and Greeks made it too. Zoroastrians do not worship fire. Fire is a medium. It is pure, it does not corrupt, it gives light and warmth without asking anything, and it is understood as a visible sign of the presence and the wisdom of Ahura Mazda. A worshipper faces the fire in the way that a person might face east, or face an altar. The direction of attention is through it, not at it. The same reverence for purity extends to the other elements, and it produced one of the most distinctive practices of the religion. Because earth and fire and water are pure, and because a corpse is understood as a source of pollution, the dead were traditionally not buried and not burned. They were exposed on high stone structures open to the sky, where birds would strip the bones, which were afterwards collected. The Greeks noticed this and found it startling. The structures are sometimes called towers of silence. And here is an honest complication that scholars have never fully resolved. The Achaemenid kings themselves were not exposed. Cyrus lies in a stone chamber at Pasargadae. Darius and his successors were placed in tombs cut into a cliff face at Nakshi Rustam, their entrances carved as palace fronts, high above the ground, which is one of several reasons why careful historians hesitate before calling these kings Zoroastrians without qualification. Consider the evidence. In inscription after inscription, the Persian kings invoke Ahura Mazda, and they do it constantly, and they attribute their kingship and their success entirely to him. That much is beyond doubt. But in all of that royal writing, across 2 centuries, the name of Zarathustra never appears. The Gathas are never mentioned. Some of the practices we associate with the developed religion are absent, and some of the things the kings did do not fit it comfortably. So a good many specialists prefer a more cautious description. The Achaemenids were Mazda worshippers, operating within an Iranian religious world that Zarathustra's teaching also came out of, and which it eventually came to define. Whether they would have recognized themselves in the label we use is a different question. Then there are the Magi. They were a priestly group, apparently Median in origin, who conducted sacrifices and interpreted dreams and performed the rituals, and Herodotus describes them with fascination. They are the reason we have the word magic, which traveled from their name into Greek and then outwards, gathering a rather different meaning as it went. They are also, in the tradition, the wise men who appear in the Christian nativity story, which is why that scene contains a small, unnoticed echo of a Persian priesthood. And then there is the largest question of all, which is what this religion may have given to the ones that came after it. The Judean exiles whom Cyrus released had spent decades living inside a Babylonian world, and then under Persian rule, and Persian rule over Judea continued for 2 centuries. Historians of religion have long noticed that certain ideas become prominent in Jewish writing during and after this period, which are much less visible before it. An organized opposing figure of evil, ranks of angels, a final judgment, a resurrection, a decisive future setting right of the world. Whether this represents genuine Zoroastrian influence, or parallel development, or something more tangled, is argued about seriously, and has been for well over a century. The dating of the Zoroastrian texts is itself uncertain, which makes the direction of influence hard to establish. I am not going to resolve it for you at this hour, but it is a real scholarly conversation, not a fringe one, and if it is even partly right, then a religion born among cattle herders somewhere in eastern Iran has been quietly shaping the imagination of a very large part of humanity ever since. The faith itself continues. It is small now. After the Islamic conquest of Iran, many Zoroastrians eventually migrated to Western India, where their descendants are known as the Parsis, a word that simply means Persians. Communities remain in Iran, particularly around Yazd, where a fire is maintained that adherents hold to have been burning continuously for something close to 15 centuries. 1,500 years of somebody getting up to tend a flame. Let that image sit for a moment and then come back down out of the hills, because the man who invoked Ahura Mazda more than anyone else also happened to be the finest administrator the ancient world produced, and we have not yet looked properly at what he actually built. Darius took an empire that had been assembled in about 30 years by conquest and turned it into a machine. Start with the problem. You have 5 million square kilometers and perhaps 20 million or more people, speaking dozens of languages, most of whom have no idea what you look like, and your fastest message travels at the speed of a horse. How do you actually govern that? His answer was the satrapy. The empire was divided into large provinces, around 20 of them depending on how you count and when, each under a governor called in Old Persian a kshatrapavan, which means roughly protector of the realm, and which reaches us through Greek as satrap. A satrap was, within his province, close to a king. He held a court, collected the revenue, administered justice, maintained the roads, and was frequently a member of the royal family or of the great Persian noble houses. It was an enormous grant of power to a man 1,000 kilometers away from anyone who could check him. So Darius checked him. The military forces in a province did not, as a rule, answer to the satrap. Garrison commanders reported separately, up their own chain, to the king. A royal secretary, attached to the provincial court, also corresponded directly with the center. So the man who collected your taxes did not command your soldiers, and the man who wrote your letters was not your employee. And then, on top of that, there were the inspectors. Greek writers describe royal officials who traveled the empire with an armed escort, arriving without much warning, examining the accounts and the conduct of provincial government, and reporting back. Their title is usually given as the King's Eye, and there is some evidence for a similar figure called the King's Ear. It was, in other words, an internal audit function with a standing military escort in the 5th century before the Common Era. The system was not perfect, and satraps did rebel, sometimes seriously. but it held for 200 years across a territory nobody had ever tried to hold before, and every land empire that came afterwards in that part of the world, including the ones that eventually replaced it, borrowed from its design. Then the money. Darius introduced a proper imperial coinage, building on what he had inherited from Lydia. There were two principal coins, a gold piece, which the Greeks called the daric, and a silver piece called the siglos. The gold was struck as a royal monopoly. Satraps might issue silver, but gold came from the king alone, which is exactly the sort of quiet control that tells you the man understood what he was doing. The design barely changed for a century and a half. On the face, a figure of the king, bearded and crowned, shown kneeling or half running, holding a bow, sometimes with a spear or a dagger. The Greeks looked at that image and started calling the coins archers, and out of that comes one of my favorite pieces of ancient sourness. When a Spartan king was forced to abandon a campaign in Asia because Persian money had been used to stir up trouble for Sparta back home in Greece, he is said to have remarked that he had been driven out by 10,000 Persian archers, not one of whom had drawn a bow. They were coins. Persia used that instrument continually and with great skill. Why send an army into Greece when the Greeks could be persuaded, at a fraction of the cost, to fight each other instead? For much of the 4th century before the Common Era, Persian policy in the Aegean was conducted almost entirely by subsidy, and it worked extremely well. Alongside the coinage came standardization of the dull and essential kind, common weights and measures, a regularized system of assessed annual tribute, so that provinces knew what they owed, rather than being plundered at the discretion of whoever turned up. Egypt paid heavily in grain, Babylonia in silver, India, according to Herodotus, in gold dust. And if that is right, it was the most valuable assessment in the empire. And one more piece of infrastructure that is easy to overlook, and was perhaps the most important of all: a single administrative language, not Persian, Aramaic. Aramaic was a Semitic language already widely spoken across Mesopotamia and the Levant, and crucially, it was written with an alphabet, on parchment and papyrus, rather than requiring wedges pressed into clay by a specialist scribe with years of training. The Persians adopted it as the working language of imperial administration, in a form now called Imperial Aramaic, and used it everywhere. Which means that an order could be dictated in Persian at Susa, written in Aramaic by a scribe, carried by relay along the royal road to Egypt or to Bactria, and there read out and translated into the local language for people who had never heard Persian spoken. The empire ran on translation, deliberately and as a matter of policy. That decision outlasted the empire by a very long way. Imperial Aramaic became the ancestor of scripts used across a huge span of Asia, and Aramaic itself remained a major language of the Near East for many centuries afterwards. Then there is Darius the engineer, and there is one project of his that people are always surprised by. He dug a canal from the Nile to the Red Sea. An earlier Egyptian ruler had begun such a work, and it had been abandoned. Darius had it completed, running from the eastern arm of the Nile Delta through the bitter lakes to the Gulf, wide enough for ships. Along its route he set up a series of large stone stelae, inscribed in Egyptian hieroglyphs on one face, and in Old Persian, Elamite and Babylonian on the other. Fragments of them have been found. The text records that he ordered the canal dug, and that ships went from Egypt through it to Persia, as he had intended. 24 centuries before the Suez Canal was cut, and along a broadly comparable idea, a Persian king joined the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean and put up signs saying so in 4 languages. He also, at the other end of the scale, seems to have understood the value of water on a village level. There is testimony that the Persian crown granted long tax exemptions to anyone who developed new agricultural land by digging a qanat, with the benefit running to their heirs for several generations. It is the ancient equivalent of a development incentive, and it is precisely the kind of policy that no monument commemorates and that quietly changes a country. And of course he built the palace at Susa, with its credited craftsmen from a dozen nations, the terrace and the Apadana at Persepolis, the tomb at Naqsh Rustam, on whose facade he set out, at some length, what he believed a king should be. That inscription is worth hearing about, because it is not what you would expect from a conqueror. He describes himself as a man who is not hot-tempered, who holds himself firmly under control when he feels anger rising, who does not do injury to the weak on account of the strong, nor to the strong on account of the weak, who rewards according to merit and punishes according to the offense. It is, transparently, a king writing his own reference, but it tells you what virtues a Persian king wanted to be seen to possess, and self-control sits at the very top of the list, above courage, above victory. All of that administration existed for a reason, and the reason arrived every year in enormous quantity. Let us talk about the money itself. Herodotus preserves a list of the annual tribute from each province, and adds it up to something in the region of 14,500 talents of silver a year. A talent is a weight, roughly 26 kilograms depending on the standard used. The arithmetic gives a figure in the hundreds of tons of silver annually, and while nobody should treat his numbers as an audited account, the order of magnitude is not thought absurd. But the tribute was never only silver. Picture the delegations coming up the Persepolis stairs again, and now look at what is in their hands. That is the tribute system carved in stone. Horses from Armenia and Cappadocia, camels from Bactria and Arabia, cattle, sheep, textiles, vessels of gold and silver, ivory tusks, bowls, bracelets, folded cloth, grain from Egypt in bulk, timber from Lebanon, precious stone from Central Asia. Gold came principally from Bactria, from Sardis, and reportedly as dust from the eastern frontier. Silver from Anatolia and the Aegean world. Lapis lazuli, that astonishing deep blue, from mines in what is now Afghanistan, which had already been supplying the entire ancient world for 2,000 years. Turquoise, from Chorasmia. Carnelian, orange red and warm. Ivory from Africa and from India. Ebony from Egypt. And silk, which needs a small honest note, because silk in this period is not what people usually picture. The great overland silk trade with China, the network we now call the Silk Road, developed considerably later, from around the 2nd century before the Common Era, but small quantities of Chinese silk were already moving west along the steppe by the 5th century, hand to hand across intermediaries. We know because some of it was found in those frozen tombs at Pazyryk, in the same permafrost that preserved the carpet. So a Persian noble might conceivably have owned a fragment of silk. It would have been rare and precious beyond ordinary reckoning, and nobody along the route it traveled would have had the faintest idea where it originally came from or what animal made it. Now, what happened to all this wealth once it arrived is the interesting part, and it is a genuine economic problem. A great deal of it was not spent, it was stored. Herodotus says that incoming tribute silver was melted down and poured into earthenware containers, and that when the metal had set, the pottery was broken away, leaving a solid bullion mass, from which pieces were cut as required. Think about what that means. Enormous quantities of precious metal, arriving year after year from every corner of the known world, being converted into blocks and put into rooms and left there, taken out of circulation entirely. The economy of half the planet slowly draining its bullion into a set of storerooms in southern Iran. It made the treasuries of Persepolis and Susa and Ecbatana something close to legendary, and eventually it made them a target. When Alexander finally reached them, the quantities he found were so great that ancient writers report he needed thousands of pack animals and camels simply to move it, and the sudden release of that hoard into the wider Mediterranean world is thought by economic historians to have had genuine inflationary effects for decades afterwards. 2 centuries of accumulation, released at once. Guarding all of it, and guarding the king, was a body of men whose name you almost certainly know, and whose name may well be a mistake. They are called the Immortals, and the story attached to them is this: a corps of exactly 10,000 elite infantry, maintained permanently at that precise number, so that the instant one of them died or fell ill or was wounded, a replacement stepped forward, and the total never altered. The unit therefore never diminished. It could not be reduced, hence the name. It is a superb piece of psychological warfare, and it comes to us from exactly one source: Herodotus. No Persian text uses the term, which has led to a suggestion, widely discussed, though not universally accepted, that something got lost in translation. There is an old Persian word, anushia, meaning companions or followers, and a similar sounding word relating to immortality. The proposal is that Herodotus, or an informant, heard the Persian for the king's companions and rendered it as the Immortals. If that is right, then one of the most famous military units in history owes its name to a misheard syllable. The unit itself was certainly real in some form, whatever it was called. Alongside it stood a still more select body of 1,000 spear-bearers, the royal guard proper, and Greek writers give them a nickname that is oddly charming: the apple-bearers, because the butt end of each man's spear was weighted with a counterbalance of gold or silver worked in the shape of a pomegranate. Imagine 1,000 men standing motionless in a hall, and at the base of every spear a small metal fruit catching the light. Their equipment was consistent with the rest of the Persian infantry, though of far better quality. A large shield of woven wicker, tall enough to plant on the ground, a short spear, a bow, carried with its arrows in a combined case at the hip, a short straight dagger at the thigh, scale armor of small overlapping metal plates sewn onto a backing, worn under the clothing rather than over it, and soft cloth headgear that could be drawn across the face. The famous glazed brick panels of archers from Susa, now in Paris, are often labeled as Immortals. They show figures in long patterned robes, bows and quivers, spears, hair and beards immaculately arranged. Whether they actually depict this unit or simply the royal guard in general is not certain, but they give you the look of the thing: enormously dignified, extremely decorative, and clearly not dressed for mud. Their duties were mostly not fighting. They stood at doors, they escorted the king when he traveled, they lined the halls during audiences. Herodotus says that when they marched they had their own baggage train, carriages carrying their households, and camels and mules bringing supplies, including specially prepared food, kept separate from the ordinary army's provisions, which is a rather human detail. The most terrifying soldiers in the world, traveling with their families and their own catering. Reputations of this kind, though, are always made by the people who face them. And in the early 5th century before the Common Era, on the far western edge of the empire, the Persians ran into a set of neighbors who would go on to write the story, and who wrote it so well that we have been reading their version ever since. I want to handle this next part carefully and slowly and without shouting, because it is the section of Persian history that has been shouted about more than any other. Here is the essential thing to hold on to, and I will return to it. For Greece, these wars were the defining event of the age, remembered forever after as the moment the Greek world survived. For Persia, they were a frontier problem on the northwestern edge of an enormous empire, which continued to function perfectly well for another century and a half afterwards. Both of those statements are true at once, and the gap between them explains almost everything about how the story reaches us. It begins with the Greek cities of the Anatolian coast, which had come under Persian control back in the time of Cyrus. In 499, before the Common Era, they revolted, encouraged by a local ruler with problems of his own, and they asked mainland Greece for help. Athens and the small city of Eretria sent ships. In the course of the revolt, Sardis, the western capital of the empire, was burned. The revolt was put down over several years, ending in a naval defeat and the destruction of Miletus, the greatest of the Ionian cities. But Persia had now been given a reason to look west and to remember two names. In 490, a Persian force crossed the Aegean, took Eretria, and landed on the coast of Attica at a bay backed by a plain, about 40 kilometers from Athens. The plain is called Marathon. What happened there was not, by imperial standards, a large battle. But the Athenians and their allies from Plataea, heavily outnumbered by most accounts, came down off the higher ground and attacked. And they attacked in a formation of massed heavy infantry, close-packed, shields overlapping, spears leveled, moving at speed across the open ground to close the distance before the archery could break them. And it worked. The Persian force was driven back to its ships with heavy losses. Herodotus gives the casualties as 6,400 Persians against 192 Athenians. Nobody should take those figures at face value. Ancient battle numbers are notoriously unreliable, and this particular set has been polished by a city that never stopped talking about the day. But the psychological effect was real and lasting. The Persians had been beaten in a straight fight by a small city on the edge of the world. And here I should clear up a story, because it is so famous. The modern marathon race commemorates a runner carrying news of the victory from the battlefield to Athens and dying on arrival. That version comes from a much later writer. Herodotus, our earliest source, tells something different and in some ways more impressive. A professional long-distance runner named Phidippides was sent from Athens to Sparta before the battle to ask for help, and covered something in the region of 240 kilometers of mountainous country in about 2 days. The race is named for the wrong journey. 10 years later, Persia came back, and this time the king came in person. Xerxes, son of Darius, assembled an expedition on a scale that awed everyone who wrote about it. The army crossed from Asia into Europe over the Hellespont, the narrow strait at the entrance to the Sea of Marmara. On bridges of boats, hundreds of vessels moored side by side with cables of flax and papyrus stretched across them, and a roadway laid over the top. Herodotus tells us that the first attempt was destroyed by a storm, and that Xerxes, in a rage, ordered the sea itself to be given 300 lashes and a set of fetters thrown into it. I would treat that story with some care. It is exactly the sort of thing a Greek writer needed to be true, because the whole Greek framing of these wars is about a proud Eastern monarch overreaching against the natural order, and a king whipping the ocean is that argument in a single image. It may have happened. It may be a story about what it means to be a tyrant. The invasion came south down the coast, army and fleet moving together, and the Greeks chose to make their stand where the coast road narrowed to a strip between mountain and sea, Thermopylae, the hot gates, named for the sulfur springs there. The defending force was commanded by Leonidas, a Spartan king, and it is worth correcting a very persistent impression. There were not 300 men in that pass. There were several thousand Greeks from a range of cities, of whom 300 were Spartan citizens with, in all probability, a substantial number of helots attending them. What made the position work was the geography. In a gap that narrow, numbers cannot be brought to bear, and heavily armored infantry fighting shoulder to shoulder can hold against a great many more men than themselves. For 2 days it held. What ended it was a mountain path. A local man showed the Persians a track over the high ground that came out behind the Greek position. Once that was known, the pass was untenable, and Leonidas dismissed most of the army. He remained, with his Spartans, and with the men of Thespiae who chose to stay, and by some accounts a contingent from Thebes, and they were surrounded and killed. It was, militarily, a Persian victory. The road to central Greece was open, and Athens was subsequently taken and its temples burned. But the defense had cost time, and it had done something to the Greek imagination that no amount of ground could buy back. The war turned in a strait of water. The Greek fleet had withdrawn to the channel between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast, and the Athenian commander Themistocles managed, by argument and reportedly by a piece of deliberate misinformation sent to the Persian side, to bring on a battle there rather than in open water. The strait is narrow. The Persian fleet was larger, which in that space was a liability rather than an advantage. Ships could not maneuver, could not turn, and became entangled with one another, while the Greek ships, heavier and built for ramming at close quarters, worked among them. Xerxes is said to have watched from a throne set up on the shore. The defeat was severe, and it changed the shape of the campaign, because a fleet was what fed and supplied an army that size. Xerxes withdrew to Asia with a large part of the army, leaving his commander Mardonius in Greece with a substantial force. The following year, at Plataea in Boeotia, that force met a combined Greek army in open ground. Mardonius was killed, and the Persian army broke. In the same season, a Greek fleet destroyed Persian ships at Mycale on the Anatolian coast, and with that, the invasion of the Greek mainland ended. Now let me put it back into proportion, because the proportion is the whole point. Persia lost a campaign at the edge of its territory. It did not lose Anatolia, or Egypt, or Babylonia, or anything else that mattered to it. The Achaemenid Empire continued for another 150 years, which is longer than the entire subsequent history of Athens as a major power. Within a generation, Persian gold was the dominant force in Greek politics, and Persian diplomacy was quietly arranging the outcome of Greek wars from a distance. Persia had failed to conquer Greece. A century later, Greek states were sending envoys to the Persian king to have their disputes adjudicated. And we should be honest about one more thing. We have essentially only one side of this story. Herodotus is our principal source, and he is a genuinely great writer, and he is often surprisingly fair to the Persians, and he had access to some remarkable information. He is also a Greek, writing for Greeks, a generation later, about a war his audience regarded as their finest hour. There is no Persian account. No royal inscription mentions these campaigns. The archives that might have told us how it looked from Susa were, as far as we know, on perishable material, and they are gone. So the numbers are Greek, the speeches are Greek, the motives attributed to Xerxes are Greek. It is the best evidence we have, and there is no realistic alternative to using it. But it is worth holding in your hand while you read, the way you would hold a letter written by one party to a divorce. Which brings us to the man himself, who has been treated worse by history than almost any other ancient ruler. Xerxes I came to the throne in 486 before the Common Era. He was the son of Darius, and importantly, his mother was Atossa, a daughter of Cyrus, which meant that in his person, the line of the empire's founder and the line of its greatest organizer were joined. Among the sons of Darius, that gave him a claim the others could not match. His early reign was spent putting down revolts, in Egypt and then twice in Babylonia, and the Babylonian risings appear to have prompted a firmer approach to that city than his predecessors had taken. He also left an inscription, found at Persepolis, and usually called the Diva inscription, in which he says that in a certain place there had been worship of divas, hostile divine beings, and that he put a stop to it and established the proper worship of Ahura Mazda. Where this happened, and whether it refers to a specific act or is a general statement of royal piety, has been argued over for the better part of a century. It is the sort of text that everyone quotes and nobody has settled. But here is what I would most like you to take away about Xerxes, and it requires nothing more than remembering where we were standing a few hours ago. The Persepolis you walked through tonight is largely his. Darius laid out the terrace and began the Apadana. Xerxes finished it. The gate of all nations, with its colossal winged bulls, is his, and his inscription is on it. The hall of 100 columns was begun under him. His own palace stands on the terrace, and much of the monumental staircase work, the site that has represented Persian civilization to the world ever since, the one on the postcards, the one people fly across the world to stand in, is in its finished form the achievement of the king, who is usually remembered as an arrogant fool who whipped the sea. He was assassinated in 465 before the Common Era, in a palace conspiracy, by a senior court official, along with one of his sons. It was a squalid end to a reign that had begun with more advantages than any Persian king had ever inherited. He appears, incidentally, in another book entirely. The Persian king in the biblical book of Esther, called Ahasuerus, is generally identified by scholars with Xerxes, which gives him a second literary afterlife, quite separate from the Greek one, and a rather kinder role in it. Take a breath here. We are past the loudest part of the night, and everything from now on gets quieter. Because for all the noise of invasions and burning temples and battles in narrow straits, the ordinary business of the empire was going on the entire time, in every direction, largely undisturbed, along those roads we walked at dusk. And that is where I want to take you next. Not to another war, but to a harbor at first light, with the sea flat and the ships coming in. The water in the harbor is completely flat, the way it only is in the hour after dawn, and it has taken on the color of the sky, so that the moored ships appear to be sitting on nothing at all. You can smell tar and rope and fish and the particular sourness of wet timber. Somewhere behind you, a donkey is complaining. On the quay, stacked in the pale light, are the things that have come in overnight, and if you walk along the line of them, you can more or less read the map of the known world. Bales of raw cotton from India, which the Greeks could not account for at all. Herodotus tried to describe it, and ended up telling his readers about trees in India that grow wool, which is not a bad description from a man who had only ever met wool on a sheep. Sacks of spice, tied twice and smelling through the sacking. Ivory in curved lengths, wrapped in cloth. Small hard packets of precious stone. Timber, teak from the east, cedar from the north. And, in tall stoppered jars from Arabia, the two commodities that made the southern desert rich, frankincense and myrrh. Both are tree resins, tapped by cutting the bark and letting the sap bleed and harden into pale lumps. Both were burned in temples from Egypt to Babylon in quantities that seem extraordinary now, and both had to cross 2,000 kilometers of desert on the backs of camels, hand to hand, through a chain of caravan cities, each of which took a cut. By the time a lump of frankincense reached a temple in Babylonia, it had traveled further than most human beings ever did, and its price reflected every mile. From Egypt, grain in bulk, linen so fine you can read through it, papyrus in rolls, and natron for preserving and for glass. From the Phoenician cities on the Levantine coast, Tyre and Sidon and Byblos, glass, which they made better than anyone, and the purple dye that made a robe cost more than a house. From the Greek world, which is worth noticing, given everything we have just been through, olive oil, wine, silver, and painted pottery. Attic pottery from Athens has been dug up right across the Persian Empire, in ordinary contexts, throughout the 5th century before the Common Era. The wars were being fought, and the pots were still coming. Trade rarely stops for politics as completely as politics would like. From Anatolia, wool and silver and horses. From Central Asia, lapis and turquoise, and camels, and the famous horses of the Nusian plain in Media. Larger and heavier than anything the Greeks bred, kept in royal herds and used for the king's chariots. All of it moving, all the time. And moving because 4 things had been put in place that nobody had ever combined before at this scale. Roads, running for thousands of kilometers and maintained. A single currency in gold and silver, of reliable weight, accepted everywhere. A single administrative language, written in an alphabet, so that a contract could be drawn up in one province and enforced in another, and enough security that a merchant could reasonably expect to arrive. That combination is what an economic historian would call a market. It is not that the Persians invented trade, it is that they lowered the cost of it across an area the size of a continent, and then held that arrangement steady for 200 years, which is long enough for people to build their lives around it. Darius also, characteristically, wanted to know what was actually out there. Herodotus records that he commissioned a Greek captain named Scylax to sail down the Indus to the sea, and then west, around Arabia, until he reached Egypt. The voyage is said to have taken about 2.5 years. Whether every detail is right, the expedition seems to have been real, and it is a reconnaissance of the Indian Ocean, commissioned by a king who wanted to know whether his eastern and western provinces could be joined by water, which they then were, at the Egyptian end, by his canal. Now walk up from the harbor into the town and into the market, because this is where the empire stops being a system and becomes a crowd. The noise arrives before you do. Not one sound but a texture, voices in 4 or 5 languages, none of them dominant. A man calling the same 3 words over and over, in a rhythm he settled on years ago, and no longer hears himself say. Chickens, the bright irregular clink of a coppersmith, somewhere badly, a flute. Color in the awnings, faded to soft reds and ochres by the sun. Underfoot, dust and straw, and crushed fruit, and the peel of something citrus that releases its oil when you tread on it. Stalls of dried fruit in mounded heaps, grain in open sacks with the tops rolled down, live animals in pens, resigned, bolts of cloth, unrolled a foot at a time by a man who does not hurry because the unrolling is the sale. Cooking oil measured out into whatever container you have brought with you. A woman selling herbs from a flat basket, everything cut this morning and already wilting at the edges. And money changing hands. Not much of it in coin, honestly, because for ordinary purchases in the countryside, people went on weighing out silver and bartering as they always had. Coinage mattered most for soldiers, for taxes, and for long-distance trade. Down at this level, a man might still pay for a jar of oil with a measure of barley, and both of them would think that entirely normal. Someone is arguing. Someone is laughing at the argument. None of these people know that they are living inside the largest empire the world has yet produced. They know the price of barley, and whose son is marrying whom, and that the road east is bad after rain. That is what an empire actually feels like from inside. Mostly, it feels like nothing. Among that crowd, doing much of the buying and a great deal of the work, are people we know far less about than we should, and I want to spend some time on them now, carefully. Women in the Persian Empire. Start with an honest statement of the problem. Almost everything a Greek writer says about Persian women is about royal women, is second-hand, and is doing a job in an argument. Ctesias in particular gives us a court dripping with poisonings and conspiracies and vengeful queens, and it makes wonderful reading and should be trusted about as far as you would trust a rival newspaper. There is also a shape imposed on this subject from a much later period. The image of the sealed harem, as a whole social institution, owes a great deal to how Europeans imagined the Ottoman court more than 2,000 years afterwards, projected backwards onto a civilization that had nothing to do with it. Persian royal women were certainly part of a structured court with rules of access. They were not invisible. We know that because of the tablets. The Persepolis archives are, once again, the thing that turns speculation into evidence. And what they show is genuinely surprising if your picture of the ancient world is the usual one. Women appear throughout them as workers. They are listed in named work groups with their own supervisors, receiving rations of grain and wine and beer as payment. They worked in textile production in large numbers, and in the treasury workshops, and in food processing, and on construction. Some groups are all female, some are mixed, and the mixed groups are sometimes headed by a woman, who is recorded as drawing a higher ration than the men she supervised, which means her seniority was recognized in the one currency an administrator cannot fake. And then there are the estates. Royal women in this empire held property in their own right, not through a husband, not held in trust. Their own land, their own villages, their own workshops, their own workforces, and they administered them personally, issuing written orders, authorized with their own seals, which officials hundreds of kilometers away then acted on. Two of them come through the archives clearly enough that you can almost hear them. One is Artistone, called in the Persian records Irtashduna. She was a daughter of Cyrus and a wife of Darius, and Herodotus says she was his favorite. The tablets do not care about that. What the tablets show is a woman with substantial estates in several places, who travels between them with a retinue, drawing supplies at stations along the road, and who issues sealed instructions for the release of large quantities of wine and grain, sometimes for feasts. One document has her authorizing the issue of 100 sheep. The other is Erdabama, whose relationship to the royal family is not certain, and who appears to have been even wealthier. She controls estates and a very large workforce, and her own seal, and she is issuing orders in her own name, at a scale comparable to senior male officials. Nobody is doing this on her behalf. There is no husband's name on the order. Below the elite, evidence is harder to come by, but not absent. From Egypt, at the island of Elephantine on the Nile, there survives a remarkable archive of documents belonging to a Jewish military community living under Persian rule, written on papyrus in Aramaic. Because it is Egypt, the papyrus survived, and in that archive there is a woman named Mibtahaya, whose family's legal papers we have across decades. We have her marriage contracts. We have records of property she owned in her own name, a house, transferred to her by her father. We have documents about her disputes. And most striking of all, the marriage contracts of that community specify that either party could initiate divorce, and set out what each would take away. That is one community, in one place, with its own traditions, under Persian administration, rather than a product of it. It is not evidence about the empire as a whole, but it is a real window, and what you see through it is a woman conducting her own legal affairs in the 5th century, before the Common Era, and the system recording it without comment. I want to be careful not to overclaim here, because it would be easy, and it would be false. This was not an equal society by any standard we would recognize. The rations in those tablets are not equal between men and women doing the same work. The extra allowance given to a woman after childbirth was larger if the child was a son. Political power was overwhelmingly male, and inheritance and marriage practices constrained women in ways that would be intolerable now. But the picture we were handed, of women shut away and legally invisible, is not what the documents show. Persian women appear in the record owning things, running things, traveling, and being paid. The evidence was sitting in those clay archives the whole time. It simply took longer to read than Herodotus did. And at certain points in the year, all of these people, the merchants and the weavers and the estate holders, and the men with the donkeys, stopped work entirely and did the same thing at the same time. Let me take you to the most important day in the Persian calendar, which is still the most important day in the Iranian calendar, 25 centuries later. It happens at the spring equinox, on the exact moment when day and night stand equal, and the light begins to win. The word for it is Nowruz, which means simply the new day. I should say honestly, as I did earlier when we were standing on the terrace, that direct evidence for how the Achaemenids celebrated the new year is thinner than the confident accounts suggest. The festival is richly documented in later periods, under the Sasanians and onwards, and there is a long tradition of reading the Persepolis tribute procession as a Nowruz ceremony, and that reading is attractive but contested. What is not in doubt is that a spring New Year festival of great importance existed in the Iranian world in some form, that it long predates the Islamic period, and that it has been celebrated continuously ever since by an unbroken chain of people, right up to this year. Something in the region of 300 million people still mark it, across Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, the Kurdish regions, the Caucasus, and the diaspora everywhere. So let me describe it as it survives, which is very likely close to how it always was in its bones. For weeks beforehand, houses are cleaned, not tidied, emptied and scrubbed. carpets beaten outside, everything washed, the whole year's dust put out of the door. The phrase for it translates as shaking the house. On the last Wednesday eve before the new year, fires are lit in the streets, and people jump over them. It is not solemn. It is largely for the young, and it involves a great deal of shouting. The line called out while jumping asks the fire to take away your pallor and sickness, and give you its redness and warmth in exchange. Wheat or lentils are sprouted in a dish weeks ahead, so that by the day itself, there is a thick cushion of new green growing in the house. That green, called sabza, sits on a spread table with a set of other symbolic things, each chosen for what it stands for: sweetness, patience, health, love, sunrise, abundance. A mirror, painted eggs, a goldfish, in more recent centuries, coins, a book of poetry, or scripture, or both. At the exact instant of the equinox, calculated to the minute, everyone is home, and everyone is together, and the year turns while you are sitting with your family looking at a table full of green things. Then 13 days of visiting. The young go to the old first, in strict order of seniority, and are given money and sweets. Everyone eats far too much, and on the 13th day, everybody, and I mean everybody, leaves the house and goes outdoors, into parks and countryside and any patch of grass available, and eats a picnic there, and takes the sprouted greens from the table and throws them into running water, sending the year's accumulated bad luck away downstream. There is something worth noticing in the design of that whole 13 days, and it is not accidental. The cleaning comes first, then the fire, then the exact moment, then the visiting in order of age, and only at the very end, the going outdoors and the letting go. It is a sequence built to move a household from one year into the next, without anyone having to think about how. You are simply carried along by the order of things, doing what was done last year and the year before, and so far back that nobody in the room could tell you when it started. Very few things human beings have made have run that long without a break. Buildings fall down, languages change beyond recognition, borders move constantly. But a family sitting down together at a calculated minute in spring has apparently been robust enough to survive conquest, religious change, several thousand years of politics, and the invention of the calendar it is now measured against. There were other festivals in the year. Mehragan in the autumn, associated with the divinity Mithra, a harvest festival at the other balance point of the year. Sade, in midwinter, a great fire festival against the cold and the dark. And there was the king's birthday, which Herodotus says was the one occasion in the year when every Persian who could afford it was expected to lay on a full feast, roasting whole animals, throwing the house open. Music ran through all of it. We have less than we would like, because sound leaves nothing behind, but there are instruments in the reliefs and in later silverwork, angular harps held against the shoulder, long-necked lutes, double pipes, drums held in one hand and struck with the fingers of the other. The scales and the melodies are gone entirely. Iranian classical music has an ancient lineage and a system of modes with very old roots. But nobody can honestly tell you what a Persian song sounded like in the 5th century, before the Common Era. Imagine it as best you can. A courtyard at night in spring, lamps in niches in the wall, too many people in too small a space, and nobody minding. Food arriving continuously, someone playing, and someone else joining in badly, and a child asleep across 2 laps, who is not going to be moved for anything. And the thing about all of this is that it is not gone. That courtyard is happening tonight, somewhere, with electric light and a phone propped against a bowl, and the sprouted wheat on the table, and the same words called across the same small fires. Empires ended, the party did not, which is a good place to stand, because we now have to watch the empire end. By the middle of the 4th century, before the Common Era, the Achaemenid state had been running for roughly 200 years. It is often described as decadent and rotten by then, And that description comes almost entirely from Greek writers who had a strong interest in explaining why it fell. The truth is more ordinary. It had had a hard century, with serious revolts. Egypt broke away and stayed independent for around 60 years before being reconquered. There had been dynastic murders and satrapal rebellions. But by the accession of Darius III in 336, before the Common Era, Egypt was back, the frontiers were intact, and the empire was still by a very large margin the wealthiest and most extensive state on earth. It simply had the misfortune to encounter, at that exact moment, one of the most effective military commanders who has ever lived, at the head of an army that had been redesigned by his father specifically for the purpose. Philip II of Macedon had built something new, a professional standing army with a reformed infantry phalanx, using an enormously long pike, combined with exceptional heavy cavalry, and drilled to fight as a single connected instrument. He had unified the Greek states under Macedonian leadership, largely by force, and announced an invasion of Persia. Then he was assassinated at a wedding. His son was 20. Alexander crossed into Asia in 334 before the Common Era, and won at the river Granicus. The following year he met Darius III himself at Issus, on a narrow coastal plain in the northeast corner of the Mediterranean, where Persian numbers could not be deployed. The Persian line broke, and Darius left the field. And here something happens that tells you a great deal about both men. Darius's mother, his wife, and his children were captured in the baggage camp. Alexander treated them with conspicuous courtesy, maintained them in royal state, and reportedly refused offers of a negotiated peace that would have given him half the empire. He went south instead, took the Phoenician coast after a famously difficult siege of Tyre, entered Egypt without resistance, and was received as a legitimate ruler, and only then turned inland. The decisive battle was at Gaugamela, in northern Mesopotamia, in 331. Darius chose open ground this time, and had it leveled in advance, so his chariots and cavalry could operate. He had the larger army, and he lost anyway, to a maneuver that opened a gap in the Persian line and drove straight for the king's position. Darius left the field a second time. After that it unraveled quickly. Babylon opened its gates. Susa surrendered with its treasury intact. There was one hard fight in the mountains, at a pass called the Persian Gates, where a satrap named Ariobarzanes held a narrow defile against the whole Macedonian army for a month, with a small force, until a path around was found, which will sound familiar. He and his men were killed where they stood, and almost nobody remembers his name, and I think that is a shame. And then Persepolis. The treasure taken there was, as we have said, beyond ordinary counting, but that is not what Persepolis is remembered for. In the spring of 330, before the Common Era, the Great Terrace burned. What happened is genuinely disputed, and the two versions are quite different in character. One tradition, found in several ancient writers, tells it as an accident of a drunken night, a feast deep into the drinking, and an Athenian courtesan named Thais, who makes a speech about the Persian burning of Athenian temples 150 years earlier, and asks whether it would not be a fine thing for the women present to avenge Greece. Torches are taken up, the king leads the way, and by morning the greatest palace complex in the world is a ruin, and Alexander regrets it. The other tradition, from the historian who is generally regarded as the most reliable, says it was nothing of the kind. It was a deliberate act of policy, decided in advance, as declared vengeance for the invasion of Greece, and Alexander's senior general Parmenion argued against it on the sensible grounds that you do not burn property you have just acquired, and that destroying the place would tell Asia he was passing through, rather than staying. Archaeology confirms the fire, and confirms it was severe. Cedar roofs came down. The floors were covered in ash and burned debris. It also suggests, in places, a fire that was set methodically, rather than one that got out of hand. We will probably never know. Both stories were circulating within a generation. But hold the consequence, because it is the reason we have anything at all. When the roofs came down, the tablets in the treasury and the fortification wall were baked hard in the heat and then sealed under the collapse. The archive that has told us about the paid workers, the mother's rations, the travel documents, Artie Stone's 100 sheep, all of it survived because the building burned. Darius III did not survive much longer. Fleeing east, he was seized by his own satrap of Bactria and murdered on the road. Alexander, pursuing, found the body. He sent it back to Persepolis to be buried in the royal tombs with full honors, and hunted the man who had done it. And then, at Pasargadae, he went to see the tomb of Cyrus. Remember it. 6 shallow steps, the small gabled chamber, the open plain. He found it broken into and stripped, and he ordered it restored, and the inscription renewed, and he had the men responsible questioned. There is something in that image worth keeping. A Macedonian king, at the head of the army that had just destroyed the Persian Empire, standing in front of the grave of the man who founded it, and giving orders to have it repaired. Because Alexander did not really want to end Persia, he wanted to be its king. He began wearing elements of Persian dress, which enraged his Macedonians. He adopted Persian court ceremonial and attempted to introduce the practice of prostration before the king, which the Macedonians flatly refused, because to a Greek, that was something you did to a god. He kept Persian satraps in post. He married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, and later a daughter of Darius III. At Susa, he staged a mass wedding, in which around 10,000 of his soldiers married Persian and Iranian women in a single ceremony, and he paid for all of it. His own men hated the whole program, and mutinied over it more than once. They had come to conquer Persia, not to become it. He died in Babylon in 323, before the Common Era, aged 32, and his generals divided the world between them within a few years. The eastern share, the Persian heartland, went to Seleucus, and here is the quiet point. The Seleucid kings kept the system. The satrapies stayed. The road network stayed. The tribute arrangements largely stayed. The Aramaic administration stayed. The new rulers spoke Greek and founded Greek cities, and the machinery underneath went on turning much as it had. Persia was not erased. It changed management, and within a couple of centuries, Iranian rule returned in the form of the Parthians, and after them the Sasanians, who consciously presented themselves as the heirs of the Achaemenids, and who fought Rome to a standstill for 400 years. The Sasanians carved their own reliefs at Nakhshe-Rustam, directly beneath the tombs of Darius and Xerxes, deliberately, so that everyone would understand the claim being made. So let us take the last of the night slowly, and think about what actually survived. Consider first the shape of government itself. The idea that a very large territory should be divided into provinces, each under a governor answering to a center, with separate military command and independent inspection, and a standardized tax assessment, and roads built for administration rather than trade. That template passed to the Seleucids and onwards, and something recognizably like it turns up in every large land empire in the region afterwards. Rome built its own version of an imperial courier service on the same principle of relay stations, and used it for the same reason. Consider the policy underneath it. Leave people their gods, their languages, their local law. Take the tribute and the loyalty, and otherwise do not interfere. It was not compassion, it was economics, and it was still a genuine departure from what had come before. When the Islamic empires later ran vast multi-religious territories through local structures and a protected status for other faiths, they were working in a tradition that had a very long history in that ground. Consider the administration. The Abbasid Caliphate, ruling from Baghdad 1,000 years later, ran on a bureaucracy heavily shaped by Persian practice, with Persian officials, Persian court ceremonial, and offices whose names are Persian words. The vizier and the government department are Persian ideas in Arabic clothes. Persian became the second great language of Islamic civilization, and the language of an enormous body of poetry, and it carried the memory of the old kings forward in the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, where Cyrus and Darius have become something closer to legend, but have not been let go. Consider the architecture, the columned audience hall, the monumental stair, glazed brick and colored tile used across whole facades so that a building shines rather than sits. Walk into a mosque in Isfahan and look up, and you are looking at a tradition of surface color that runs back through a great many centuries to the Ishtar Gate and to the painted stone of Persepolis. Consider the gardens, 4 quarters, crossing channels, a pool at the center, a wall around it. Laid out at Pasargadae for Cyrus, carried forward through every subsequent Persian dynasty into Islamic Spain, into Mughal India. That plan is under the Alhambra. That plan is under the Taj Mahal. And every time anybody anywhere uses the word paradise, they are using a Persian word for a walled garden, worn smooth by 25 centuries of use. And consider, finally and carefully, the matter of rights. I told you earlier that the Cyrus cylinder is not a charter of human rights, and I stand by that. It is a Babylonian foundation document written by Babylonian scribes, justifying a conquest in the language of Marduk. But something else is also true. In 1971, and at the United Nations, and in a great many classrooms since, people looked at that object and chose to make it mean something. They read it as the moment a ruler first said that conquered peoples might keep their gods and go home. And whether or not that is what the clay says, the choice to read it that way has itself now been part of the world for over 50 years. We do that with the past constantly. We reach back into it for the thing we need. It is worth being honest about when we are doing it, which is why I have taken the trouble to tell you what the cylinder actually says. And it is also worth noticing that we reached for Persia, out of all the ancient empires available, when we wanted an image of tolerance. There was a reason to hand, not a perfect one, but a real one. So, the lamps are low now, and we are almost at the end. Think back over where we have been tonight. We started on a silt plain between 2 rivers, with a man pressing a reed into wet clay to count sheep. We watched Assyria carve its own cruelty onto its walls, and then vanish so completely that people 2 centuries later walked past its capital and could not say who had built it. We followed a small mountain kingdom nobody would have bet on. We stood on a windy plain in front of 6 shallow steps and a small stone chamber. We rode a road at night, in relay, carrying somebody's sealed instruction east. We climbed 111 very shallow stairs, deliberately, without hurrying. We stood in front of a wall where 23 different peoples come forward in their own clothes, carrying their own things. We read the receipts of the women who were paid to build it. We drank water from a stone channel in a walled garden, in the shade, in the heat of the day. We sat with a fire that somebody has tended without a break for 1500 years. And we watched the whole thing burn, and then watched the men who burned it put on Persian clothes and keep the paperwork. Every one of those kings believed, and said so in stone, that what they built was permanent. None of it was. The empire lasted 220 years or so, which is a long time in a human life, and almost nothing at all in the life of that landscape. And yet, the tomb at Pasargadae is still standing. It has now outlasted the empire that built it by more than 10 times over. 13 of the 72 columns of the Apadana are still upright, on a terrace where the wind moves through and makes no sound. Under the dry plains of Iran, Carnuts dug by hand before Alexander was born are still carrying cold water down out of the mountains to villages, by gravity, requiring nothing, the way they were designed to. Somewhere tonight a family is putting sprouted wheat on a table and waiting for the exact minute the year turns. And in 100 languages, when people want to describe the most beautiful place they can imagine, they use a Persian word for a garden with a wall around it. That is what actually lasts. Not the tribute, not the treasuries with their blocks of poured silver, not the armies whose names may have been a misheard word anyway. What lasts is water arriving where people need it, a plan for a garden, a day in spring, a habit of leaving other people their gods. The stone gets quieter and quieter, and the ordinary things go on. So let it all go now, gently. Let the terrace go dark. Let the delegations on the staircase stand where they are, holding their bowls and their folded cloth, in the grey stone that used to be blue and gold. Let the road empty. The courier has already gone through. The fires in the courtyard are down to embers, and the animals have settled, and nobody is going to wake you. The garden is still there behind its wall. The channel is still running over its cut stones, making that sound, in the dark, whether anyone is listening or not. The cypresses are perfectly still. You have nowhere to be. The water keeps moving. The fire is being tended. The year is about to turn. And in the morning, none of it will need anything from you either. Rest now. Sleep into power, guys. Good night.
you.